Dove Books on Tape presents Memories of Midnight by Sidney Sheldon. Read by Jenny Agutter. Kowloon, May 1949. It must look like an accident. Can you arrange that? It was an insult. That was something you asked a bum you had picked up off the streets. He could feel the anger rising in him, but he said nothing, for in truth he was afraid of the man seated across from him. He had heard too many chilling stories about him, and he had reason to believe them. So all he said was, "Yes, sir. No one will ever know." Even as he said the words, the thought struck him, "He knows that I'll know." He waited. The man was studying him with cold, obsidian eyes. Finally he spoke. "Very well. I will leave the method to you." "Yes, sir. Is the target here in Kowloon?" "No, London. Her name is Catherine. Catherine Alexander." A limousine drove the man to the Blue House on Lasker Row. The Blue House was open to special patrons only. Heads of state visited there, and movie stars, and presidents of corporations. The management prided itself on discretion. Everything was for sale in the Blue House. Virgins, boys, lesbians, and animals. The Blue House was a cornucopia of forbidden pleasures. The man had ordered the twins this time. They were an exquisitely matched pair with incredible bodies and no inhibitions. He remembered the last time he had been there. Their soft, caressing tongues and fingers, their hot mouths plundering his body. He felt the beginning of an erection. "We're here, sir." 3 hours later, when he had finished with them, the man ordered the limousine to head for Modi Road. The Taoist priest waiting for him looked like a figure from an ancient parchment. The priest greeted him, then closed his eyes in a silent prayer and began shaking the chim, the wooden cup filled with numbered prayer sticks. A stick fell out, and the Taoist priest consulted his chart and turned to his visitor. "The gods say you will soon be rid of dangerous enemy." The man felt a pleasant jolt of surprise. Knowing it was mere superstition, it was none the less another good luck omen. Today was Agius Constantius Day, his birthday. The gods have blessed you with good feng shui. Doje, Huwa. 5 minutes later, he was in the limousine on his way to the airport, where his private plane was waiting to take him back to Athens. Ioannina, Greece, July 1948. She woke up, screaming every night, and it was always the same dream. She was in the middle of a lake in a fierce storm, and a man and a woman were forcing her head under the icy waters, drowning her. She awakened each time, panicky, gasping for breath. She had no idea who she was, and she had no memory of the past. She spoke English, but she did not know what country she was from or how she had come to be in Greece, in the small Carmelite convent that sheltered her. As time went by, there were tantalizing flashes of memory that came and went too quickly for her to grasp them. They always caught her off guard, filling her with confusion. In the beginning, she had asked questions. The Carmelite nuns followed an order of silence, and the only one permitted to speak was Sister Teresa, the elderly Mother Superior. She had heard innumerable times how she had been in a small boat, capsized on the lake during a storm. 2 of the sisters rescued her, but nothing more about her was known. In the beginning, she had been too ill to be concerned about herself, but slowly she had regained her strength and her health. The atmosphere was serene and calm, and yet she could find no peace. "I'm lost," she thought, "and no one cares. Why? Have I done something evil? Who am I? Who am I?" The images continued to come, unbidden. One morning, she awakened suddenly with a vision of herself in a room with a naked man undressing her. Was it a dream, or had it happened in her past? Who was this man? Did she have a husband? She had no ring, no possessions other than her black habit and a pin, a small golden bird with ruby eyes and outstretched wings. She was anonymous, a stranger living among strangers. There was no one to tell her that her mind had been so traumatized that it could stay sane only by shutting out the terrible past. And the images kept coming, faster and faster, pieces tumbling into place. But the pieces made no sense. She had a vision of a movie studio filled with men in army uniform, and one soldier, handing her a bouquet of flowers, laughing. She later dreamed about the same man. She was saying goodbye to him at the airport, and she woke sobbing because she was losing him. There was no more peace for her after that. These were not mere dreams. They were pieces of her life, her past. I must find out who I am. And unexpectedly, in the middle of the night, a name was dredged out of her subconscious. Catherine. My name is Catherine Alexander. Athens, Greece. The empire of Constantin Demiris could not be located on any map, yet he was the ruler of a fiefdom larger and more powerful than many countries. He was one of the 2 or 3 wealthiest men in the world, and his influence was incalculable. He had no title or official position, but he regularly bought and sold prime ministers, cardinals, and kings. He was a charismatic man, with a brilliantly incisive mind, physically striking, tall, with broad shoulders. He had the face of a hawk, a predator. And when he chose to, Demiris could be irresistibly charming. He was a connoisseur of beauty, and he found women irresistible. Constantin Demiris prided himself on being a patriot, but he paid no taxes. He was above the rules that applied to ordinary men. In his veins ran ichor, the blood of the gods. Nearly every person Demiris knew wanted something from him, and he enjoyed the challenge of figuring out what it was that people were really after. He trusted no one. His motto was, keep your friends close, but your enemies closer. The outside world was permitted to see only his geniality and charm. There was no reason to suspect that beneath the amiable facade, Demiris was a killer, a gutter fighter, whose instinct was to go for the jugular vein. He was an unforgiving man who never forgot a slight. Justice and vengeance were one and the same. He remembered every affront he had ever suffered, and those who were unlucky enough to incur his enmity were paid back 100-fold. There were few players in Demiris' game with whom he had not yet evened the score, but he was in no hurry. He enjoyed the anticipation, the planning and execution of his justice. These days he made no enemies, for no man could afford to be his enemy, so his quarry was limited to those who had crossed his path in the past. Demiris had started life as the son of a stevedore in Piraeus. He had 14 brothers and sisters, and there was never enough food on the table. From the very beginning, Constantin Demiris showed an uncanny gift for business. At 16, he had saved enough to open a food stand on the docks with an older partner. The business flourished, and his partner cheated Demiris out of his half. It took Demiris 10 years to destroy the man. The young man was burning with a fierce ambition. He would be rich. He would be famous. He had no idea how it was going to happen. He only knew that it would. On Demiris' 17th birthday, he came across an article about the oil fields in Saudi Arabia, and his future beckoned. 1 month later, Constantin Demiris was on his way. He had no qualms about signing a 2-year employment contract. Demiris planned to stay in Saudi Arabia for as long as it took him to make his fortune. He envisioned a wonderful Arabian Nights adventure. The reality was a shock. On an early morning in summer, Demiris arrived at Fadili, a dreary camp in the middle of the desert. There were 1,000 workers there, mostly Saudis. Demiris got the welcoming speech from the personnel manager. You're going to love it here. You're 1,000,000 miles from nowhere, bad food, no women that you can touch without getting your balls chopped off, no alcohol, steal anything and you lose a hand, second time the other hand, kill anyone, you're beheaded. I'm not planning to kill anyone. Wait, you just got here. The compound was a Tower of Babel. People from a dozen different countries all speaking their native languages. Demiris had a good ear and picked up languages quickly. They worked in temperatures over 100 degrees, suffering from flies, mosquitoes, and dysentery. Nearly all the higher echelons, geologists, surveyors, engineers, and chemists, were Americans. The young man went out of his way to make friends with them. Constantin Demiris spent as much time as he could around the drillers, and he never stopped asking questions. He stored away the information, absorbing it the way hot sands soaked up water. It was all utterly fascinating to the young man, and his questions were endless. He knew one day he was going to own oil wells. There were two new arrivals, an English geologist and his wife. Henry Potter was in his late 60s, and his wife, Sybil, was in her early 30s. In any other setting, Sybil Potter would have been described as a plain-looking, obese woman. In Fathili, she was a raving beauty. And Henry Potter's work forced him to leave her alone a great deal. Young Demiris was assigned to help her move out of their quarters and to assist her in getting settled. "This is the most miserable place I've ever seen in my life," Sybil Potter whined. "Your husband is doing a very important job," Demiris assured her. She eyed the attractive young man speculatively. "My husband isn't doing all the jobs he should be doing. Do you know what I mean?" Demiris knew exactly what she meant. "No, Ma'am." "Well, I think you and I are going to become very good friends." "I have to go back to work," Demiris said. Over the next few weeks, Sybil Potter constantly found excuses to send for the young boy. Demiris knew that the geologist was a very important man, and he had no intention of getting involved with Potter's wife and jeopardizing his own job. Oil was the future, and he was determined to be part of it. One midnight, Sybil Potter sent for Demiris. She opened the door, wearing a thin nightgown that unfortunately concealed nothing. "Come in, Costa. The bedside lamp doesn't seem to be working." Demiris averted his eyes and walked over to the lamp. "There's no bulb." And he felt her body pressing against his back and her hands groping him. "Mrs. Potter," and her lips were on his, and she was pushing him onto the bed, and he had no control over what happened next. His clothes were off, and he was plunging into her, and she was screaming with joy. "That's it! Oh, yes, my God, it's been so long!" She gave a final gasp and shuddered. "Oh, darling, I love you." Demiris lay there, panicky. As though reading his mind, Sybil Potter giggled. "This will be our little secret, won't it, darling?" Their little secret went on for the next several months. There was no way Demiris could avoid her. What made it worse was that Sybil Potter had fallen madly in love with him. "I'll divorce Henry, and we'll get married." Demiris felt trapped. "Sybil, I have no money." "That's no problem. I know how you can make some money, sweetheart." "You do?" She sat up in bed and told him that Henry had just discovered a big new oil field. He hadn't yet sent in his report. It was right here. Demiris' heart beat faster. She handed him an envelope, and he opened it. He read every word carefully. "Is that information worth anything?" It was a report on a new field that could possibly turn out to be one of the richest oil fields in history. Demiris swallowed. Yes, it could be." "Well, there you are," Sybil said happily. "Now we have money." Demiris sighed. There was one more problem. Money to buy the options on the land surrounding the field. Sybil shrugged and asked if $5,000 would be enough. Demiris could not believe what he was hearing. "Yes, I don't know what to say." "It's for us, darling. For our future." He asked her to hold on to the report for a few days, and she agreed readily. With the $5,000 that Sybil gave him, Constantin Demiris bought up options on acres of land around the new potential strike. Some months later, when gushers appeared on the main field, Constantin Demiris was an instant millionaire. He repaid Sybil Potter the $5,000, sent her a new nightgown, and returned to Greece. She never saw him again. Catherine Alexander heard voices from her past, but they were muffled and fragmented, and they filled her with confusion. "You're a very special lady, Cathy." "It's over. I'm in love with someone else. I want a divorce. I know how badly I've behaved. I'd like to make it up to you." "He tried to kill me." "Who tried to kill you?" "My husband." The voices would not stop. They were a torment. The convent should have been a wonderful, peaceful haven, but it had suddenly become a prison. But she had no idea where she belonged. There were no mirrors in the convent, but there was a reflecting pool outside near the garden. Catherine walked slowly over to it and looked down. The pool reflected a lovely sun-tanned woman with black hair, a beautiful woman in her early 30s with flawless features and solemn grey eyes that seemed filled with pain. A woman lost. "I need someone I can talk to," Catherine thought desperately. She went into Sister Teresa's office. She asked the nun if she could consult a doctor who could help her regain her memory. Sister Teresa shook her head, but Catherine insisted. She knew she belonged to the outside world, and she had to find out who she was. At last, Sister Teresa said she would give the matter some thought. When Catherine left, Sister Teresa sat at her desk for a long time. It was a difficult decision that she had to make. Finally, she reached for a piece of paper and began to write. "Dear Sir," she began, "something has happened that I feel I should call to your attention. Our mutual friend has informed me that she wishes to leave the convent. Please advise me what to do." He read the note, then sat back in his chair. "So, Catherine Alexander wants to come back from the dead. Too bad. I'll have to get rid of her. Very carefully." The first step was to remove her from the convent. Demiris decided it was time to pay Sister Teresa a visit. The following morning, Demiris had his chauffeur take him to Ioannina. Driving through the countryside, Demiris thought about Catherine Alexander, how beautiful she had been when he first met her. She had had everything, Demiris thought. And then the gods had taken their vengeance. Catherine had been married to one of his pilots, and their marriage had become a living hell. Almost overnight she had aged 10 years and had become a fat, blousy drunk. Demiris sighed. What a waste. "You did the right thing by telling me," Demiris assured Sister Teresa. "Does she remember anything of her past?" Sister Teresa shook her head. "No, the poor dear." Constantin Demiris moved to the window and looked out. There were 3 nuns in the garden below. One turned, and his breath caught in his throat. She was beautiful. What had happened to that fat, ravaged woman? "What do you want me to do with her?" "Let me think about it," Demiris said. "I'll be in touch with you." Constantin Demiris had a decision to make. Catherine Alexander's appearance had caught him by surprise. She had changed so completely. No one would know it was the same woman, he thought. And the idea that came into his head was so diabolically simple that he almost laughed aloud. That evening he dispatched a note to Sister Teresa. It's a miracle, Catherine thought. A dream come true. Sister Teresa had stopped by to tell her that a benefactor had appeared, a friend of Sister Teresa's who wished to help Catherine. Yet a chill ran through her. She was going out into a strange world she could not even remember. And who was her benefactor? Catherine was unable to sleep for the next 2 nights. The idea of leaving the convent was suddenly terrifying. Please, God, keep an eye on me. On Monday, the limousine arrived for Catherine. She had been awake all night thinking about the unknown future that lay ahead of her. Sister Teresa walked her to the gate that led to the world outside. We will pray for you. Remember, if you decide to return, you will always have a place here. Catherine thanked her, but in her heart she knew that she was never going to return. The long drive to Athens filled Catherine with a mixture of excitement and fear. Was she going to learn what terrible thing had happened in her past? Soon they were in the middle of the bustling city. It all seemed so strange and yet oddly familiar. I've been here before, Catherine thought excitedly. Soon they reached an enormous estate high on a hill. She was greeted at the door by an elegant man. Kalimera. The word for good morning sprang to Catherine's lips unbidden. Kalimera. Mr. Demiris is waiting for you in the library. Demiris. It was a name she had never heard before. Why was he interested in helping her? Catherine followed the man through the elegant mansion and was ushered into the library. Demiris looked up as Catherine entered and rose. He searched for a sign of recognition on her face, but there was none. Welcome. I am Constantin Demiris. What is your name? Did she remember her name? Catherine Alexander. He showed no reaction. Welcome, please sit down. She's magnificent, thought Demiris. It's a shame to destroy anything that beautiful. At least she will die happy. It's very kind of you to help me, Catherine began. He smiled. It's really quite simple. From time to time I help out Sister Teresa. When she wrote to me about you, I told her that I would be happy to try and help. Did Sister Teresa tell you that I've lost my memory? Yes. He asked offhandedly, "How much do you remember?" "I know my name, but I don't know much more than that. Perhaps I can find someone in Athens who knows me." Constantin Demiris felt a sudden alarm. That was the last thing in the world he wanted. "That's possible, of course," he said. Carefully, he changed the subject. "I've arranged a suite for you here. I think you will be comfortable." "Thank you, Mr. My friends call me Costa." Catherine was led into a fantastic bedroom suite, and she sank down on the soft bed, feeling as though she were in a dream. Who was this stranger, and why was he being so kind to her? An hour later, a van pulled up, filled with clothes that Demiris had arranged for her approval. A couturier, Madame Dimas, ordered Catherine to undress so as to assess her figure. Madame Dimas looked her over with a practiced eye. She was impressed. "You have a fine figure. I think we're going to be able to do very well for you." Boxes of dresses, underwear, blouses and shoes were brought in. I can't afford any of these," Catherine protested. "I have no money." The couturier laughed. "Mr. Demiris is taking care of it." "But why?" The couturier was quick and efficient, and 2 hours later Catherine had half a dozen beautiful outfits. It was overwhelming. She sat there not knowing what to do with herself. "I'm all dressed up," she thought, "with no place to go." But there was some place to go, into the city. The key to whatever had happened to her was in Athens. She stood up. "Come on, stranger. We're going to try to find out who you are." Catherine went downstairs and asked the butler to call a taxi for her. Instead, one of Demiris' limousines was brought round front, and she was on her way into town. Would Mr. Demiris be angry if she went into the city? He had not said not to. Catherine was dazzled by the noisy, bustling city and the ruins and monuments that appeared all round her. Modern hotels and office buildings were everywhere amid the timeless ruins, an exotic mixture of the past and the present. "I've seen this before," Catherine thought, and I was happy. As the limousine passed a hotel on a corner of Syntagma Square, Catherine asked the driver to stop. "I recognize this hotel. I've stayed here." Her voice shaky, she asked the driver to let her out and return for her in 2 hours. The driver opened the door for her, and she stepped out. She was trembling. She felt as though she were on the edge of a precipice, about to fall into an unknown, terrifying abyss. She moved through the crowds. After the solitude of the convent, everything seemed unreal. Catherine moved toward the Plaka, the old section of Athens in the heart of the city, moved by some instinct within her. She passed a taverna on top of a roof overlooking the city and stopped, staring. I've sat at that table. There were 3 of us. But who were they? Catherine moved on. She seemed to know exactly where to go. Everything seemed familiar, and nothing. She passed a cafe called Treflinkas. A memory was nagging at her mind. Something had happened to her here, something important, but she could not remember what. A man was hurrying down the street toward her, staring at her. He slowed, a look of recognition on his face. "Hello." He seemed very pleased to see her. Catherine took a deep breath. "Do you know me?" He grinned. "Of course I know you." Catherine felt her heart leap. Could we talk?" "I think we'd better." Catherine was on the edge of panic. The mystery of her identity was about to be solved, and yet she felt a terrible fear. What if I don't want to know? What if I've done something dreadful? The man led her toward a small taverna. "I'm so glad I ran into you," he said. "So am I," Catherine breathed. They were seated, and a waiter took their order. "You're very beautiful," the man said. "This is fate, don't you agree?" "Yes." She took a deep breath. "Where did we meet?" He grinned. "Is that important? Paris or Rome or anywhere?" He reached forward and pressed her hand. "You're the prettiest one I've seen around here. How much do you charge?" Catherine stared at him uncomprehendingly, then, shocked, sprang to her feet. "Hey, what's the matter? I'll pay you whatever." Catherine fled, her eyes filled with tears of humiliation. Ahead was a small taverna with a sign that read, "Madame Pyrrhus, fortune-teller." Catherine stopped. "I know Madame Pyrrhus." Her heart began to race. She opened the door and stepped inside. The room was familiar. She asked the waiter for Madame Pyrrhus and was directed to a table to wait. An incredibly old woman dressed in black moved toward the table. She stopped, peering into Catherine's face. Her eyes opened wide. "I knew you once, but your face," she gasped. "You've come back." "You know who I am?" Catherine asked eagerly. The woman's face was filled with horror. "No, you're dead. Get out." Catherine moaned faintly. "Please, I just..." "Go, Mrs. Douglas." The woman made the sign of the cross, turned and fled. Catherine sat a moment, then rushed outside. The voice followed her. "Mrs. Douglas." And then it was as though a floodgate opened up. Dozens of brightly lit scenes poured into her head, a kaleidoscope of images out of control. "I'm Mrs. Larry Douglas. I was madly in love with him, but something had gone wrong. Something..." She had tried to commit suicide and woke up in a hospital. She had been drinking a lot because she had lost Larry. But then he had come back to her. They were at the Triflinkas Cafe, and Larry was saying, "I'd like to make it all up to you, Kathy. How would you like to go on a second honeymoon? I know a wonderful little place called Ioannina." And then the horror had begun. On a mountaintop with Larry, she was lost in a grey mist, and he moved toward her, ready to push her off the edge. At that moment, tourists arrived and saved her. And then the caves. Larry had taken her deep into the bowels of the caves and left her there to die. She was rescued and taken back to the hotel. But in the middle of the night, she had awakened and heard Larry and his mistress in the kitchen, planning her murder. "No one will ever... I told you I would take care of it. Now, while she's asleep." And now she remembered running away in that terrible storm, being pursued by them, getting into the rowboat. In the middle of the lake, the boat had started to sink and she had lost consciousness. Catherine sank onto a bench. So her nightmares had been real. Her husband and his mistress had tried to kill her. She thought again about the stranger who had come to visit her at the convent shortly after her rescue. He had given her an exquisite golden bird. "No one will hurt you now. The wicked people are dead." She could still not see his face clearly. Finally she rose and walked to the hotel to meet the driver who would take her back to Constantin Demiris, where she would be safe. "Why did you let her leave the house?" Constantin Demiris demanded. "I'm sorry, sir," the butler replied. "You didn't say anything about her not leaving," so Demiris calmed himself and dismissed the butler. It was dangerous for Catherine Alexander to appear in the streets of Athens where someone might recognize her. Too bad I can't allow her to live. But first, my vengeance. I'm going to enjoy myself with her. London will be safe. We can keep an eye on her there. An hour later, when Catherine returned to the house, Constantin Demiris instantly sensed the change in her. It was as though a curtain had been lifted and Catherine had suddenly become alive. She was wearing a white silk suit, and Demiris thought, sexy. "Mr. Demiris, I know who I am and what happened." His face revealed nothing. "Really? Sit down and tell me." She paced, the words tumbling out. "My husband and his mistress, Noelle, tried to kill me. Some nuns from the convent saved me." She turned suddenly. "My husband worked for you, didn't he?" Demiris hesitated. "Yes." How much should he tell her? "He was one of my pilots. I felt a sense of responsibility toward you." "But you knew who I was. Why didn't you tell me this morning?" "I was afraid of the shock," he said smoothly. "What happened to my husband and that woman?" "They were executed." She paled and sank into a chair. "They were executed by the state, Catherine." "But why?" "Careful. Danger. Because they tried to murder you." "But I'm alive." "Catherine, Greek laws are very strict, and justice here is swift. They had a public trial, witnesses testified. They were convicted and sentenced to death." "Oh, it's hard to believe," she said, dazed. Constantin put his hand on her shoulder. "You must put the past out of your mind. They paid for their sins." He lightened his tone. "I think you and I should discuss the future. Do you have any plans?" She did not hear him. Larry, she thought. Larry's handsome face laughing. She broke a reverie. "No, I don't know what I'm going to do. I suppose I could stay in Athens." "No," Demiris said firmly. "That would bring back too many unpleasant memories. I suggest you leave Greece. I have offices in London. You once worked for a man in Washington named William Fraser. Do you remember that?" The memories hit her. That had been one of the happiest times of her life. "Yes, I was his administrative assistant." "You could do the same job for me in London." She hesitated, and he patted her hand sympathetically. "I understand. You need some time to think. Why don't you have dinner in your room and we'll discuss it in the morning?" Asking her to have dinner in her room was a last-minute inspiration. He could not afford to have his wife run into her. "You're very generous," she said. "And the clothes are—" He held her hand a fraction longer than necessary. "Not at all." She sat in her bedroom watching the sunset. There is no point reliving the past. There is the future to think about. Thank God for Constantin Demiris. He was her lifeline. And now a job in London. Would she take it? Long after Catherine had gone, Demiris sat thinking about their conversation. Noelle. Only once in his life had Demiris permitted himself to lose control of his emotions. He had fallen deeply in love with Noelle Page. She had become his mistress. He was obsessed with her. She had given up stardom to be at his side. Demiris had trusted her completely, and she had betrayed him with Larry Douglas. It was a mistake Noelle had paid for with her life. Demiris had arranged for her to be buried in the cemetery on Pesara, his private island. Everyone had remarked on what a beautiful gesture it was. In fact, he had arranged it so that he could have the pleasure of walking over the bitch's grave. Even now, more than a year later, Demiris wasn't able to stop thinking about her. "Why, Noelle, why? I gave you everything. I loved you. You bitch, I love you." And then there was Larry Douglas. He had paid with his life. But that was not enough. Demiris had another vengeance in mind, a perfect one. He was going to take his pleasure with Douglas's wife, as Douglas had done with Noelle. Then he would send Catherine to join her husband. "Costa!" It was his wife's voice. Melina walked into the library. Constantin Demiris was married to Melina Lambrou, an attractive woman from an aristocratic Greek family. "Costa, who is the woman I saw in the hall?" Her voice was tense. "She's a friend of a business associate. She's going to work for me in London. She reminds me of someone, the wife of that pilot who used to work for you. But that's impossible. They murdered her." "Yes, they murdered her." He watched Melina walk away. He would have to be careful. Melina was no fool. I never should have married her, Demiris thought. It had been a bad mistake. 10 years earlier, the wedding of Melina Lambrou and Constantin Demiris had sent shockwaves through international circles. Only 1 month before the wedding, the bride had been engaged to marry another man. Melina had one brother, Spiros, who was 10 years older than she, and they adored each other. Their parents had died in a boating accident when Melina was 13, and it was Spiros who reared her. Spiros was extremely protective of her, too much so, Melina thought. As Melina reached her late teens, Spiros examined critically all her suitors. None was good enough. Finally, the right man appeared. Count Vasilis Manos, in his mid-40s. He was a successful businessman and had fallen in love with the beautiful Melina instantly. Spiros urged her to accept his proposal, but she found him unromantic. She was finally persuaded, however, and accepted. The wedding date was set, and 1,000 invitations were sent out. It was then that Constantin Demiris entered Melina Lambrou's life. They had met at one of the dozen or so engagement parties that were being given for the betrothed pair. Demiris' brooding black eyes and elegant words caught her attention before she was whisked away. That night, just before falling asleep, Melina thought about Demiris. She'd heard about him, of course. He was wealthy, a widower, a ruthless businessman, and a compulsive womanizer. Oh, I'm glad I'm not involved with him, Melina thought. The gods were laughing. The next morning, a package arrived from Demiris. "So, he thinks he's going to impress me with his wealth. Well, I'm going to send it right back." Melina opened the package. It was a book by her favorite author. How could he have known? She wrote a polite thank you note and thought, "That's that." The following morning, another package arrived. This time, it was a recording by her favorite composer. From that day on, there were gifts every day. Her favorite flowers, perfume, music and books. Demiris had taken the trouble to find out what Melina's tastes were, and she could not help but be flattered by his attention. When Melina telephoned to thank him, he invited her to lunch. What could it hurt? She accepted. Demiris was waiting for Melina when she arrived. "I was so afraid you might change your mind. I always keep my word." "And I keep mine. I am going to marry you." Melina shook her head. "Mr. Demiris, I am engaged to marry someone else." Constantin waved his hand. Manos was not right for her, he insisted. "I will make you the happiest woman who ever lived." She pulled her hand from his and asked him to stop sending her gifts. "You don't want to break my heart, surely?" She smiled, and he told her that he had dreamed of her for a long time. When he was young and poor, he dreamed of being wealthy like the Lambrou family. He fabricated a story about how he had gained his wealth, and Melina listened intently. It was not long after they were married that Melina learned that the story was pure fiction. Melina Lambrou had no intention of seeing Constantin Demiris again, but he invariably managed to appear at the same party or event that Melina was attending, and each time she felt his overpowering magnetism. Beside him, Vasilis Manos seemed boring. Demiris sent her a painting she had admired. When she protested about its expense, he insisted that she repay him by having dinner with him that night. She finally agreed. The man was irresistible. A week later, Melina broke off her engagement to Count Manos. When Melina told her brother, he was stunned. "But why? You must be crazy. Demiris is a monster. He'll destroy you." "We're in love, Spiros." "You're in love," he snapped. "I don't know what he's after, but it's nothing to do with love." But there was nothing he could do to talk his sister out of the wedding. A month later, Melina Lambrou and Constantin Demiris were married. In the beginning, it seemed to be a perfect marriage. Constantin was amusing and attentive, an exciting and passionate lover. On the first night of their honeymoon, he said, "My first wife was never able to give me a child. Now we will have many sons." The day Melina learned she was pregnant, Constantin was ecstatic. In her third month, Melina miscarried. Constantin reacted like a madman. "What did you do?" he screamed. "How could it happen?" "Costa, I swear." He calmed himself, then said, "All right, we'll have another son." I can't have another child." He stood there, frozen, then turned and stalked out without a word. From that moment on, Melina's life became a hell. Demiris carried on as though his wife had deliberately killed his son. He ignored her and began seeing other women. Melina could have borne that, but what made the humiliation so painful was the pleasure he took in publicly flaunting his liaisons. The press gleefully chronicled all his romantic adventures. At length, Spiros came to her. "Just give me the word," he said, "and I'll kill the son of a bitch." "He can't help it," she said. "Why don't you divorce him?" It was a question Melina Demiris had asked herself often in the long, lonely nights she spent by herself. And it always came down to the same answer. "Because I love him." At 5:30 in the morning, Catherine was awakened by an apologetic maid. "Excuse me, miss. Mr. Demiris asked if you would join him for breakfast on the terrace." "Thank you," she said. "I'll be right there." 20 minutes later, Catherine was escorted to an enormous terrace overlooking the sea. Demiris studied Catherine as she walked toward him. There was an exciting innocence about her. He was going to take it, make it his. He imagined her naked in his bed, helping him to punish Noelle and Larry again. He rose to greet her. He apologized for the early hour and asked if she had thought about his proposal. "Yes," Catherine said. "I think I would like to try it." Demiris concealed his relief. "I'm delighted," he said. Catherine hesitated, then asked, "Mr. Demiris, why are you doing all this for me?" "I feel a sense of responsibility. I introduced your husband to Noel Page." "Ah," Catherine said slowly. "Noelle and Larry, they had died for each other. Larry must have loved her so much." Catherine forced a question. How were they executed? They were shot by a firing squad. Oh, she could feel the bullets tearing into Larry's flesh, ripping apart the body of the man she had loved so much. She was sorry she had asked. Demiris changed the subject. Can you be ready to leave for London this morning? She paused, then said, yes. Excellent. By the way, he said casually, now that your memory has returned, perhaps there's someone you'd like to get in touch with, someone you'd like to let know that you were all right. He watched her carefully. The name Bill Fraser sprang to her mind, but she was not ready to face him yet. When I get settled, she thought. No, Catherine said finally, there's no one. She had no idea that she had just saved William Fraser's life. Demiris handed her an envelope. An advance on her salary, he explained, and she would be staying at the company flat in London. You're much too generous. He took her hand. You'll find that I'm... Handle her carefully, he thought. That I can be a very good friend. You are a very good friend. Demiris smiled. Wait. 2 hours later, Demiris helped Catherine into the Rolls-Royce that would take her to the airport. 5 minutes later, he was on the phone to London. She's on her way. Catherine recognized the private plane as one that Larry had flown. She shut her eyes. Demiris is right. That's the past, and nothing can change it. She was shaken by the mixture of emotions that Larry's name brought. And the memories. The wonderful, terrible memories. It was the summer of 1940, the year before America got into the war. She had been fresh out of college and got her first job in Washington, D.C. with William Fraser at the State Department. She had beat out all the other applicants with her wit and resourcefulness and was elated. Catherine enjoyed the excitement of working for Fraser. He was a bachelor, wealthy and social, and he seemed to know everyone in Washington. 6 months later, they had fallen in love. In his bedroom, Catherine said, I have to tell you something. I'm a virgin. Fraser shook his head. How did I wind up with the only virgin in the city of Washington? One day, William Fraser told Catherine that their office was to supervise the making of a recruiting film to be shot at MGM in Hollywood. Fraser was to be in London and asked Catherine to handle it. He reassured her, and she was soon on her way to Hollywood. The stage was filled with extras, most of them in ill-fitting army uniforms. She wound her way to the director, Alan Benjamin, who was screaming at the casting director, and introduced herself. Thank God, the man said. You take over. I don't know what I'm doing here. I had a magazine editing job in Dearborn, got drafted, and was sent to write training films. What do I know about directing? This is all yours. He turned and hurried away, leaving Catherine standing there. A man moved towards her, an amused smile on his face. He introduced himself as Tom O'Brien, the assistant director. Tom explained that he had worked on 6 previous Hollywood films and would be glad to help her out. Relieved, Catherine looked around. She had the actors line up to inspect costumes and was irritated when one actor in particular paid no attention and continued talking to some giggling girls. Excuse me, we'd like to get to work, she called. He was extraordinarily handsome, with black hair and stormy dark eyes. His uniform fit perfectly. On his shoulders were the bars of a captain, and he had a splash of brightly coloured ribbons on his chest. Catherine ordered him to take off the medals. The country wasn't yet at war. He slowly obeyed. After the morning shooting, while Catherine was at lunch, the man walked up to her table. Was I convincing enough for you? His manner infuriated her. You enjoy wearing that uniform and strutting around with medals, don't you? Have you ever thought of enlisting? And get shot at? That's for suckers. Catherine was furious. And when he had the audacity to ask her to dinner, she exploded. Don't bother coming back to the set, she snapped. We'll send your check. What's your name? Larry. Larry Douglas. The experience rankled Catherine, but for some reason she found it difficult to forget it. And him. End of side 1. When Catherine returned to Washington, William Fraser invited her out to dinner to celebrate. She knew that this was the night he was going to propose. They went to an exclusive club. In the middle of dinner, Larry Douglas walked in, still wearing his uniform with all the medals. Catherine watched disbelievingly as he walked over to their table and greeted not her, but Fraser. "Kathy, this is Captain Lawrence Douglas. Larry's been flying with the RAF. He's one of our real heroes, and is going to head up a fighter base in Washington to get some of our boys ready for combat." Catherine blanched. She had been so smug, so overbearing, and she had called him a coward. She wanted to crawl under the table. The next day, Larry Douglas telephoned Catherine at her office, but she refused to take his calls. When she finished work, he was outside, waiting for her. He had taken off his medals and ribbons, and when she looked into his eyes, she knew she was lost. There was a magnetic force about him that was irresistible. "What do you want from me?" "Everything. I want you." They had gone to his apartment and made love, and it was an exquisite joy that Catherine had never dreamed possible, that rocked the universe until there was an explosion that became a delirious ecstasy. And she had lain there spent and numb, holding him tightly, never wanting this feeling to stop. They were married 5 hours later in Maryland. Now, seated in the plane on her way to London to begin a new life, Catherine thought, "We were so happy. Where did it go wrong? I believed in my husband so much. Can I ever believe in anyone again? What did I do to make him want to murder me?" "Miss Alexander." Catherine looked up, startled. The pilot was standing over her. "We've landed. Welcome to London." There was a limousine waiting for Catherine at the airport, and she was driven to the company flat. Unbelievable. Constantin Demiris was either the most generous man in the world or... She simply could not think of any alternative. He's the most generous man in the world. I'll have to find a suitable way to show my appreciation. The flat was utterly luxurious and fully staffed with servants. She was greeted by the housekeeper, Anna, who showed her to her rooms. Catherine was beginning to take it all in her stride. Catherine wandered around the flat until Anna had finished unpacking. There was a feeling of total unreality about everything. 48 hours ago, she had been watering rose bushes at the convent. Now she was living the life of a duchess. She wondered what the job would be like and vowed to work hard. Suddenly exhausted, she lay down for a nap. She woke up suddenly, gasping from the nightmares that had overwhelmed her. "That's enough," she thought. "It's over. No one's going to hurt you, not anymore." Outside Catherine's bedroom, Anna, the housekeeper, had been listening to the screams. She waited a moment, and when there was silence, she went to the telephone to report to Constantin Demiris. The Hellenic Trade Corporation was located off Piccadilly. The building was a masterpiece of graceful architecture. When Catherine arrived, a half-dozen people waited to greet her. The names and faces were a blur to her. Then she was led to her elegant office. There were fresh flowers on the desk. "From Demiris," she was told. "He's so thoughtful." Evelyn Kay, the office manager, made her comfortable and then explained that the London office was one of the nerve centres of the Demiris empire. They coordinated the reports from the overseas divisions and sent them on to the headquarters in Athens. And Catherine was to be Evelyn's assistant. Catherine nodded, unsure of what would be expected of her. Evelyn then took her to an office down the corridor and explained that Wim van Dien was the office mathematical genius, an odd sort. His mind worked faster than most calculating machines. They arrived, and Evelyn introduced Catherine to Wim. Wim stared at his feet. "Wim!" He glanced up. Catherine I's real name was Martha Skavronskaya. She was a servant girl born in 1683 who was captured by the Russians. She married Emperor Peter I and was Empress of Russia from 1725 to 1727. The information poured out like a fountain, in a monotone. Catherine was stunned. That's very interesting," she managed. Wim van Dien looked away. "Wim is shy when he meets people," Evelyn explained. Shy, Catherine thought. The man is weird. And he's a genius? What kind of a job is this going to be? In Athens, Constantin Demiris was listening to a report from Alfred, Catherine's chauffeur in London. No, Miss Alexander had gone nowhere but the flat, had no contact with anyone outside the company. Demiris replaced the receiver, satisfied. She presented no immediate danger to him, and he would see that she was watched. She was alone in the world. She had no one to turn to except her benefactor, Constantin Demiris. I must make arrangements to go to London soon, Demiris thought happily. Very soon. Catherine found her new job interesting. Daily reports came in from Constantin Demiris' far-flung empire. Steel mills in Indiana, automobile factories in Italy, a newspaper chain in Australia, a gold mine, an insurance company. Catherine collated the reports and sent the information directly to Wim van Dien. Wim glanced at the reports once, put them through the incredible computer that was his brain, and almost instantly calculated the percentages of profit or loss to the company. Catherine learned about the old building which housed the company. Built in 1721, it had had many uses and served as an official air raid shelter during the Second World War. The air raid shelter was a large, bomb-proof room located in the basement, which also housed a large, antiquated boiler. "It looks so dangerous," Catherine said. "Is there any chance that it might explode?" "Of course not, miss. If the boiler should ever get too hot, this safety valve releases all the excess steam, no problem." After work, there was London, a playground of theatre, ballet and music. She explored the city, relishing her discoveries and acquisitions. From time to time, unbidden thoughts came into Catherine's mind. There were so many things to remind her of Larry. No, the past is finished. The future is what's important. And each day she became stronger. Catherine was alone most of the time, but she kept herself too busy to be lonely. She plunged into her days as though trying to make up for the precious moments of her life that had been stolen from her. "I'm alive," she thought. "No one is born happy. Everyone has to make his own happiness. I'm a survivor, and wonderful things are going to happen." Wim van Dien was an enigma. Catherine had never met anyone like him. He remembered everything he had ever seen, or heard, or read. The range of his knowledge was incredible. The simplest question on any subject would trigger a stream of information, yet he was antisocial. She questioned Evelyn about him, who said that Wim had no friends and never dated. Catherine sensed that Wim was isolated and lonely, and she felt a kinship with him. Catherine liked the people she was working with, but Wim became special to her. He was brilliant beyond comprehension, and at the same time, he seemed withdrawn and lonely. Catherine said to Evelyn one day, "Isn't there some chance that Wim might lead a normal life, fall in love and get married?" "He has no emotions. He will never get attached to anyone." But Catherine did not believe it. Once or twice she had caught a flash of interest, of affection in Wim's eyes, and she wanted to draw him out, to help him. Or had it been her imagination? Constantin Demiris telephoned. It was late at night, and Catherine was preparing to go to bed. She was glad to hear his voice. After all, he was the only one in the world who really knew about her past. She felt as though he were an old friend. He was coming to London the next day, he said, and asked if she were free for dinner. She accepted warmly, at last a chance to tell him how grateful she was to him. When Demiris replaced the receiver, he smiled to himself. The chase is on. They had dinner at the Ritz. It was exquisite, but Catherine paid no attention to anything except Demiris. There was so much she had to tell him. She told him about the office staff and Wim, but Demiris was not listening to the words. He was studying her, thinking how beautiful she was, how vulnerable. "No," he thought, "I'll play the game slowly and savor the victory. This one will be for you, Noelle, and for your lover." He had come to London to begin his campaign to make Catherine emotionally dependent on him. He leaned forward. "Catherine, did I ever tell you about the time I worked in the oil fields in Saudi Arabia?" Demiris took Catherine to dinner again the next night. He was delighted with her progress, he said, and was going to give her a raise. "But you've been so generous already." He looked into her eyes. "You don't know how generous I can be." Catherine was embarrassed. His only being kind, she thought. I mustn't imagine things. The following day, Demiris invited her to ride to the airport with him. She found him fascinating, almost spellbinding, and she was flattered by his attention. She watched his plane take off, thinking, "I'm going to miss him." Everyone had always been amazed by the apparent close friendship of Constantin Demiris and his brother-in-law, Spyros Lambrou. Spyros Lambrou was almost as rich and powerful as Demiris. They seemed friendly competitors. Better than that, buddies. In reality, they were implacable rivals who despised each other. When one would undertake a business venture, the other would strive to outdo him. They were exactly opposite in temperament. Where Demiris had come from the gutter and fought his way to the top, Spyros Lambrou was born an aristocrat. Spyros Lambrou was also a superstitious man. He appreciated his good fortune in life, and he was anxious not to antagonize the gods. From time to time, he consulted psychics for guidance, one in particular. She had predicted his sister Melina's miscarriage and what would happen to the marriage, and a dozen other things that had come to be. She lived in Athens. Her name was Madame Pyrrhus. Over the years, Spyros Lambrou and Demiris had carried on the charade of friendship, but each was determined that in the end he would destroy the other. Demiris because of his instinct for survival, Lambrou because of his brother-in-law's treatment of Molina. One morning, early, Demiris got a call from his private secretary telling him that Spyros Lambrou planned to acquire a company called Aurora International, which was to receive a huge government contract. When the news hit, the stock would jump. Hours later, Constantin Demiris had notified all his newspapers that Aurora International was being investigated for fraud. He then called his stockbroker and told him that when the stock dropped, to buy it all. Once he owned it, he would announce the rumours unfounded. And he notified the New York Stock Exchange that Spiros had bought his stock on insider information. A mile away, Spyros Lambrou was working in his office. He should have been a happy man, but it was impossible as long as Constantin Demiris was alive. He had always hated Demiris for his treatment of Melina, but the savage rivalry between them had its own terrible nexus. It had begun 10 years earlier with a lunch Spyros Lambrou had with his sister. She had never seen him so excited. He told her of his latest idea to build a fleet of supertankers. For the money to build them, he would go to the American oil companies. If they would give him contracts, he would go to a bank for the loans. Melina was so excited about her brother's idea that she mentioned it to Demiris that evening at dinner. Demiris scoffed. It was a harebrained scheme, he said. Melina was disappointed. Let Spiros have his dream, he said. In fact, don't even mention that she had told him about it. Early the next morning, Demiris was on his way to the United States to discuss large tankers. If he could get just one of the large companies to agree, the others were sure to follow. His first meeting with Standard Oil was a success. He was taken directly to the president, and a deal was struck. That was just the beginning. By the time Spyros Lambrou learned what was happening, it was too late. He flew to the United States and was able to make a few deals for large tankers with some independent companies, but Demiris had skimmed off the cream of the market. Melina felt miserable about what had happened. She felt she had betrayed her brother. But when she confronted her husband, he shrugged. I didn't go to them, they came to me. And that was the end of the discussion. But business considerations were unimportant compared to Lambrou's feelings about how Demiris treated Melina. Demiris' flings could have been shrugged off as well, but he had been so blatant about it. It was an insult not only to Melina, but to the whole Lambrou family. Demiris' affair with the actress Noelle Page had made headlines all over the world. One day, Spyros Lambrou thought. One day. Nikos Veritos, Lambrou's assistant, walked into the office. Veritos had been with Lambrou for 15 years. The rivalry between the two men seemed a golden opportunity to Veritos. He was betting on Demiris to win, and from time to time he passed on confidential information, hoping for a suitable reward. Veritos ushered an Anthony Rizzoli into Lambrou's office. After the formalities, Rizzoli proposed a charter of some of Lambrou's ships. Lambrou leaned back and studied the man in front of him. Unsavoury. After a moment he said, "My ships are not available to you." "Why not?" "You're a drug dealer, Mr. Rizzoli. You're crazy. You've been listening to a lot of rumours." But they were more than rumours. Spyros Lambrou had carefully checked out the man. Tony Rizzoli was mafia, one of the top smugglers in Europe, and word was out that Rizzoli's transportation sources had dried up. "I'm afraid you'll have to go elsewhere." Tony Rizzoli sat there, eyes cold. He stood and tossed a business card on Lambrou's desk, saying, "If you change your mind, call me." When Tony Rizzoli walked out the door, Nikos Veritos said, "Is he really?" "Yes. Mr. Rizzoli deals in heroin. If we ever let him use one of our ships, the government could put our whole fleet out of business." Tony Rizzoli was furious. That fucking Greek. How had he known about the drugs? Tony Rizzoli had never lost a shipment, and he did not intend to lose this one. A $10 million load. He'd have to call Sicily and stall. Tony Rizzoli had risen from the streets to become a right-hand man to Lucky Luciano, and he felt himself to be a winner, no matter the obstacles. Over the years, smuggling had grown more difficult. That's why Rizzoli had gone to Spyros Lambrou. His fleet was above suspicion. It was unlikely that the police would search one of his cargo ships, but the bastard had turned him down. I'll find another way, Tony Rizzoli thought. But I'd better find it fast. Catherine, am I disturbing you? It was midnight. No, Costa, it's nice to hear your voice. I'll be coming to London in a few weeks. I look forward to seeing you. Fine. Good night, then. This time she was calling him, to thank him for a lovely locket he had sent her. It's so easy, Demiris thought. Little gifts and flattery. Later, my wife and I are separating. Then the, I'm so lonely stage. A vague talk of marriage and an invitation to his yacht on his island. This time, Demiris thought, it's going to have a different ending. She's going to die. He telephoned Napoleon Chotas. The lawyer was delighted to hear from him. Demiris needed a favour. He wanted the lawyer to purchase for him, using another name, the villa that Noel Page had owned in Raffina. Chotas sat there, staring at the phone. The villa was the love nest where Noel Page and Larry Douglas had carried on their affair. What did Constantin Demiris want with it? Napoleon Chotas was one of the preeminent criminal lawyers in the world. He tried only murder cases and had a spectacular record of success. He had a brilliant, trenchant mind and a flair for quiet theatrics that never failed to win him his cases. The firm of Tristis and Tristis was without question the most prestigious law firm in Greece. The founders had long since retired, and the firm belonged to Napoleon Chotas. There were half a dozen partners, but Chotas was the guiding genius. Whenever people of wealth were accused of murder, their thoughts invariably turned to Napoleon Chotas. His record was phenomenal. Napoleon Chotas had excellent reason to be pleased with his life. There was only one cloud on his horizon. His name was Frederick Stavros, and he was the newest member of Tristis and Tristis. The other lawyers in the firm were constantly complaining about Stavros, but Chotas could not fire him. A philosopher once said, "Be careful what you wish for, you might get it." Frederick Stavros, the junior member of Tristis and Tristis, got his wish, and it had made him one of the most miserable men on earth. His conscience was killing him. A year earlier, Stavros had defended Larry Douglas on trial with Noel Page for the murder of Douglas's wife, Catherine. Napoleon Chotas had been hired by the powerful Constantin Demiris to defend his mistress. From the beginning, Stavros had been happy to let Chotas take charge of both defences. He was in awe of the brilliant lawyer. Near the end of the trial, Chotas told Noel, Larry, and Stavros privately that if the defendants would plead guilty, Larry would be deported and Noel would receive only a 5-year sentence. Noel Page and Larry Douglas had eagerly agreed to change their pleas. Back in court, the Chief Justice said, "A death penalty has never been given where a murder has not definitely been proven to have been committed. We were surprised when the defendants changed their plea to guilty. We have no choice but to pronounce that Noel Page and Lawrence Douglas shall be executed by firing squad." And that was the moment when Stavros knew that Napoleon Chotas had tricked them all. Chotas had been hired by Constantin Demiris not to defend Noel Page, but to make sure she was convicted. This was Demiris' revenge on the woman who had betrayed him. I can't let this happen, Stavros thought. And then Napoleon Chotas had come up to Stavros and invited him to lunch with him and his partners. 4 weeks later, Frederick Stavros was a full partner in the firm of Tristis and Tristis. He had sold his soul to the devil, but he had since realized that it was a bargain too terrible to keep. I can't go on like this. At length he went to see Napoleon Chotas. He said, "Leon, I'm grateful for what you've done for me, but I can't stay here. I'm being torn apart." "I don't understand." "What we did to Noel Page and Larry Douglas, don't you feel any guilt?" Chotas frowned, careful. "Believe me, we have nothing to reproach ourselves with. They were guilty. We convicted them. We tricked them. I can't live with it any longer. I'm giving you my notice." "I won't accept it," Chotas said firmly. "Do you have any idea what you're doing? You're throwing away a brilliant career, your life." "No, I'm saving my life." So you've definitely made up your mind. Yes, I'm sorry, Leon, but you don't have to worry. I won't ever discuss what happened. He turned and walked out. Napoleon Chotas sat for a long moment, then made a decision. That afternoon, he was seated in Constantin Demiris' office. He told him of Frederick Stavros' decision to leave. There was a heavy silence. He promised not to discuss what occurred in court, Costa. Do you believe him? Yes, I do. Demiris smiled. Well, then we have nothing to worry about, have we? Chotas rose, relieved. I suppose not. I just thought you should know. You were right to tell me. Demiris thanked Chotas and walked him out of the office. On Friday, in the late afternoon, Frederick Stavros knelt before Father Constantino in the huge church, confessing his sins. When he left, half an hour later, he felt like a different man. It was as though a tremendous burden had been lifted from his shoulders, and for the first time since that terrible day, he felt whole again. I'll start a new life. I'll make up somehow for the terrible thing that I've done. Thank you, Father, for giving me another chance. Frederick Stavros reached the street corner and started across the intersection. A black limousine started down the hill, thundering toward him. Stavros stared, frozen. It was too late to jump out of the way. There was a thundering roar, and Stavros felt his body being smashed and split open. There was an instant of excruciating pain, and then darkness. The next morning, Napoleon Chotas came across an article in the newspaper. His blood froze. Mr. Frederick Stavros was struck and killed last evening by a hit-and-run driver. Witnesses report that the vehicle was a black limousine with no license plates. Chotas sat, rigid. Was it an accident? Constantin Demiris had told him there was nothing to worry about, but too many people had made the mistake of taking Demiris at face value. Chotas called Demiris and told him the news. What? My God, Leon, I'm sorry. Maybe I can put a little pressure on the police to find the driver. Napoleon Chotas was an expert at reading between the lines. Constantin Demiris was genuinely surprised. He had nothing to do with Stavros' death, Chotas decided. The following morning, Napoleon Chotas was approached by a stranger in the private garage of his office building. An alarm in Chotas' mind went off, and he slammed his briefcase into the man's face. You son of a bitch! The man pulled out a gun with a silencer attached. Hey, what's going on? A uniformed guard ran towards them, and the stranger fled. Chotas composed himself and thanked the guard, then went upstairs. It could have been a coincidence, Chotas told himself. But you don't use a silencer to rob people. No, he intended to kill me. And Constantin Demiris would have professed to have been as shocked by the news as he had been about the death of Frederick Stavros. I should have known, Chotas thought. Demiris can't afford to leave any loose ends. Well, Mr. Demiris is in for a surprise. He called his secretary and cancelled all his meetings and had his calls held. He took a tape recorder from the desk drawer and sat there thinking. Then he began to speak. That afternoon, Chotas appeared at the office of the prosecuting attorney, Peter Dimonides, carrying an envelope. He was ushered inside, and after exchanging pleasantries, he came to the subject of his business. I want to leave an envelope with you. It is to be opened only in the event of my accidental death. Are you expecting something to happen to you? It's a possibility. I see. Peter Dimonides promised Chotas to put the envelope in a safe place, and assured him that everything would be taken care of. 1 hour later, a messenger appeared at the offices of the Hellenic Trade Corporation with a package for Mr. Demiris. It had to be delivered personally, he explained, and he was shown into Demiris' office. Demiris signed the slip, then opened the package once he was alone. There was a tape player in it. Curious. He pressed a button and the tape began to play. Napoleon Chotas' voice came into the office. My dear Costa, everything would have been so much simpler if you had believed that Frederick Stavros did not intend to reveal our little secret. He went on explaining, as he now knew that even he was not safe from Demiris. He had written out the entire account of the trial of Noel Page and Larry Douglas and had given it to the prosecuting attorney. The tape ended. Constantin Demiris sat there, staring into space. When Napoleon Chotas returned to his office that afternoon, the fear had left him. Demiris was a dangerous man, but he was not a fool. He was not going to harm anyone at the risk of putting himself in jeopardy. I have checkmated him, Chotas smiled to himself. During the next few days, Napoleon Chotas was busy getting ready for a new murder trial. His instincts told him that he had another winner. On Wednesday, he arrived home at 1 a.m. and finally fell asleep. In his dream, he was cross-examining a witness when the man started pulling off his clothes. "I'm burning up," the man said. "It is hot in here." Napoleon Chotas opened his eyes. Flames were licking at the bedroom door and smoke was pouring into the room. He sat up, instantly awake. Chotas hurried to the window, but it was jammed shut. The smoke was getting thicker, and it was becoming difficult to breathe. There was no escape. A wall collapsed, and a sheet of flames engulfed him. He screamed. He was on fire. Blindly, he threw himself at the closed window and crashed through it, his blazing body hurtling to the ground 16 feet below. Early the following morning, Prosecutor Peter Demonides was ushered into Constantin Demiris' study. "Thank you for coming, Peter. Have you brought it?" "Yes, sir." He handed Demiris the envelope that Napoleon Chotas had given him. "I thought you might like to keep this here." "That's thoughtful of you, Peter. I've had my eye on you for some time. I think you've an important future. I'd like to find a suitable position for you in my organization. Would you be interested?" Peter Demonides smiled. "Yes, Costa. I would be very interested." "Good. We'll have a nice chat about it over breakfast." London. Catherine spoke to Constantin Demiris at least once a week, and it became a pattern. He kept sending gifts, and when she protested, he assured her that they were merely a small token of his appreciation. As a matter of fact, Catherine was proud of how well she was doing. Her old skills had come back, and the office was much more efficient. "I'm very proud of you," Demiris told her. And Catherine felt a glow. He was such a wonderful, caring man. "It's almost time to make my move," Demiris decided. With Stavros and Chotas out of the way, the only person who could link him with what happened was Catherine. The chance of that was slight, but as Napoleon Chotas had found out, Demiris was not a man to take chances. He had bought the villa in Rafina. He would take Catherine there and make love to her, just as Larry Douglas had made love to Noelle. After that... One morning, Catherine saw a newspaper article that jolted her. William Fraser was coming to London to work out a trade agreement. William Fraser. He had been such an important part of her life. What would have happened if I hadn't left him? Summoning her courage, Catherine dialed the hotel where William was staying. She had a feeling that the past was about to become the present. She asked for Mr. William Fraser, and the operator said, "I'm sorry, did you say Mr. or Mrs. William Fraser?" Catherine felt as though she had been struck. What a fool I am. Of course he would be married by now. She hung up the phone. "I'm too late. Costa was right. Let the past remain the past." Catherine threw herself into her new life, enjoying all that London had to offer. But it was no fun doing things alone. And then Kirk Reynolds came along. It was in the office that a tall, attractive man walked up to Catherine and said, "I'm Kirk Reynolds. Where have you been? I've been waiting for you." That was how it began. Kirk Reynolds was an American attorney working for Constantin Demiris on international mergers. He was in his 40s, serious-minded and attentive. When she'd discussed Kirk Reynolds with Evelyn, the older woman warned her to be careful. "Don't rush into anything, dear." "I won't," Catherine promised. Kirk Reynolds squired Catherine around London, showing her little-known sights. Together they discovered many things, and Catherine was spellbound. One evening he invited her to accompany him on a ski vacation in St. Moritz. The question caught her completely off guard. I don't know, Kirk." "Will you think about it?" "Yes." Her body was trembling. She was remembering how exciting it had been to make love with Larry, and she wondered whether she could ever feel anything like that again. "I'll think about it." When Kirk Reynolds dropped Catherine off at the end of the evening, he said, "You won't forget about St. Moritz, will you?" "No, I won't forget." Why can't I just say yes? Constantin Demiris phoned late that night. Catherine was tempted to tell him about Kirk Reynolds, but at the last moment she decided not to. Athens. Father Constantino was perturbed. From the moment he had seen the newspaper report of Frederick Stavros' hit-and-run death, he had been haunted by it. The priest had heard thousands of confessions, but the dramatic confession of Frederick Stavros, followed by his death, had left an indelible impression. "Hey, what's bothering you?" Father Constantino turned to look at the beautiful young man lying naked in bed beside him. "Nothing, love." Then what's the problem? You're ignoring me. I'm sorry, darling, it's just that one of my parishioners was killed in an automobile accident, and he had a terrible secret. What kind of secret? The priest stroked the young man's thigh. You know I can't discuss that. It was told to me in the confessional. I thought we didn't have secrets from one another. We don't, Georgius. But Georgius Lato began stroking Father Constantino's body. Oh, don't stop. Then tell me. Very well. I suppose it can't really do any harm now. Georgius Lato had come up in the world from the slums as a male prostitute at age 12. When Lato met Nikos Veritas, the assistant to the tycoon Spyros Lambrou, Lato's life changed. I'm in love with you, Nikos Veritas told the young boy. I want you to stop whoring around. You belong to me now. Despite the boy's promise, Veritas fretted about what Lato was doing when he was away from him. He came up with a solution. A job at Spiros Lambrou's company as a delivery boy. He enjoyed it, and the freedom to pick up extra money outside from appreciative clients like Father Constantino. When Georgius Lato left Father Constantino that afternoon, his mind was in turmoil. The stunning news meant a profit, and he decided to go to the big boss with it. The following morning he arrived at Spiros Lambrou's office. 10 minutes later he stood before Lambrou himself. As the young man began his tale, Spiros Lambrou found himself very interested. The marriage of Constantin Demiris and Melina had been disintegrating for years, but there had never been any physical violence until recently. It had started in the middle of a heated argument about an affair Demiris was having with Melina's closest friend. "You turn every woman into a whore," she screamed. "Shut your fucking mouth. My brother was right, you're a monster." Demiris slapped her hard across the face. She ran from the room. The following week they had another argument, and Constantin struck her again. Melina packed her bags and flew to her brother's private island. She stayed there for a week, miserable and lonely. She missed Demiris and began to make excuses for what he had done. But in the end she knew she could not bear to dissolve her marriage. The following Sunday she returned home. "So you decided to come back?" "This is my home, Costa, but I will tell you something. If you ever touch me again, I will kill you." And he looked into her eyes and knew that she meant it. In an odd way, their marriage seemed to improve after that episode. He was careful not to lose his temper, and she did not plead with him to stop his affairs. One evening, Demiris was preparing to go out. Melina reminded him of a dinner engagement they had with Spiros. "I haven't forgotten. Something more important has come up. And I know what it is. You're Pulaki, and you're going to one of your whores to satisfy it. You're becoming a fishwife, Melina. I won't let you do this." To deliberately insult her brother was too much. She had to find a way to hurt him, and there was only one way she knew. "We should both stay home tonight. Don't you know what today is?" "No." "It's the anniversary of the day I killed your son, Costa. I had an abortion." He froze, his eyes dark. "I told the doctors to fix it so I could never have another one of your children," she lied. He completely lost control. "Scasse!" And he punched her in the face, and kept hitting. Melina screamed and ran. Constantine followed. He caught her at the head of the stairs. "I'll kill you for that," he roared. And as he hit her again, Melina lost her balance and fell, crashing down the long staircase. She lay at the bottom, whimpering in pain. Demiris stood staring, eyes cold. "I'll have one of the maids call a doctor. I don't want to be late for my engagement." When Spiros Lambrou walked into Melina's hospital room, he stared down at her, appalled. Melina had a broken arm, concussion, and her face was badly swollen. "Constantin," he said, voice trembling with rage. "He didn't mean it," she whispered. "I'm going to destroy him, I swear it on my life." Spiros Lambrou had never felt such rage. He could not bear what Constantin was doing to Melina. There had to be a way to stop him, but how? He needed advice. Spiros decided to consult Madame Pyrrhus. They were seated at a table in the dim cafe. "I need some help, Madame Pyrrhus," Lambrou said. She nodded. "There was a murder trial about 1.5 years ago. A woman named Catherine Douglas was— No, the stars told me she would die." "She did die," he said. "She was killed. She's alive. She was here 3 months ago. They kept her at the convent." And all the pieces suddenly fell into place. The information Spiros had received from Georgius Lato, fitted in perfectly. Demiris had sent 2 innocent people to their deaths for Catherine's murder, while she had been very much alive, hidden away by the nuns. And Lambrou knew how he was going to destroy Constantin Demiris. Tony Rizzoli. Tony Rizzoli's problems were multiplying. Everything that could go wrong was going wrong. It was not his fault, but he knew that the family would hold him responsible. They were not tolerant of excuses. What had made it particularly frustrating was that the first part of the drug operation had gone perfectly. He had smuggled a shipment into Athens from Colombia with no problems and had it temporarily stored at a warehouse. He had bribed an airline steward to smuggle it out on a flight from Athens to New York. And then, just 24 hours before the flight, the idiot had been arrested for drunk driving and the airline had fired him. Tony Rizzoli had turned to an alternate plan. He had arranged for a mule. In this case, a 70-year-old tourist named Sarah Murchison, who was visiting her daughter in Athens, to take a suitcase back to New York. She had no idea what she would be carrying. It was souvenirs for his mother, he explained, and the lady was delighted to do it for him. She was perfect for the job, a sweet, all-American grandmother. The only thing customs would be worrying about her smuggling would be knitting needles. The following morning, as Rizzoli was about to leave for the warehouse to pick up the package, his telephone rang. "Mr. Rizzoli?" It was a stranger's voice. "Yes?" "This is Dr. Patsaka at the Athens emergency ward. We have a Mrs. Sarah Murchison here. She tripped and fell last night and broke her hip. She was very anxious for me to tell you how sorry." Rizzoli slammed the phone down. "Murder. That was 2 in a row. Where was he going to find another mule?" And if that weren't enough, he had learned that a hotshot American narcotics agent was in Athens working with the Greek authorities. Tony Rizzoli placed a call to the family through a public international telephone exchange. At length the call went through. He explained the situation to his associates in Sicily. As he expected, they were not pleased. The line went dead. A man in a grey suit watched as Tony Rizzoli exited, then flashed his badge at the operator and commandeered the phone call records. He thanked her and examined the number. Sicily, Palermo. The men in Palermo discussed the problem. Had Tony Rizzoli gotten greedy? "Too bad," one man said. "I always liked Tony." The villa at Rufina was ready. The realtor had said to Constantin Demiris, "I know you bought it furnished, but perhaps some new furniture." "No, I want everything as it is." Exactly as it was when his faithless Noelle and her lover Larry were there betraying him. Demiris walked into the bedroom. There was a large bed in the corner, their bed, where Douglas had caressed Noelle's naked body, where he had stolen what belonged to Demiris. Well, he had paid, and he would pay again. "I'll make love to Catherine here first," Demiris thought. "Then the other rooms, all of them." He telephoned Catherine from the villa. "Hello?" "I've been thinking about you," he said. Tony Rizzoli had 2 unexpected visitors from Sicily. They walked into his hotel room unannounced, and Rizzoli instantly smelled trouble. The men had been sent by Pete Luca, Tony's boss. They informed him, their speech punctuated with their fists, that Luca wanted the dope in New York fast. I could probably take these 2 guerrillas, Rizzoli thought. But he wouldn't be fighting them, he'd be fighting Pete Luca. He sighed. Everything was under control, he assured them. The men nodded. Just to make sure, they'd be sticking around. He had 1 week. Tony was panicked. How could the old man turn on me like this? I've been like a son to him. I need a mule, fast, he decided. The casino. I'll find a mule there. At 10 o'clock that evening, Rizzoli drove to a popular casino and wandered round the huge, busy gaming room. There were always plenty of losers, ready to do anything for more gambling money. Rizzoli spotted his target almost immediately at a roulette table. He was a small, bird-like man in his 50s, who was constantly stabbing at his forehead with a handkerchief. Rizzoli watched him with interest. He had seen the symptoms before, a compulsive gambler losing more than he could afford. He wondered how much the pigeon was already hooked for. He took a seat next to the man and bought into the game. After a while, the last of the man's chips were swept away. He looked hopefully at the croupier, who shook his head. The man sighed and rose. Rizzoli stood and offered to buy the man a drink. The man blinked and accepted gratefully. "I've found my mule," Rizzoli thought. He introduced himself to the man. "I'm Victor Korontzis," he replied. As they sipped their drinks, Rizzoli learned that the man had a wife and 4 children. Better and better, he thought. Kourounsis told him that he was a curator at the Athens State Museum, in charge of all the antiquities that are dug up in Greece. Rizzoli found himself becoming interested. The artifacts were priceless, the little man continued proudly. Of course, there were laws against taking them out of the country, but the museum sold replicas, and they were quite good. Rizzoli's brain began to work furiously, and he bought Kourounsis another drink. He asked if he could visit the museum, say, the next morning. Kourounsis agreed eagerly, happy to show him around. Tony Rizzoli had a feeling that he was onto something more profitable than a mule. Victor Kourounsis gave Tony Rizzoli a personally conducted tour through the cases of relics and artifacts, gold cups and crowns and centuries-old statues. Rizzoli pointed to one figurine and asked its value. If it were for sale, many millions. Really? The little curator was filled with obvious pride as he walked around, pointing out his priceless treasures. He showed him his favourite, an exquisite amphora. Rizzoli cut through the description to ask, how much is it worth? I suppose about $10 million. For that? Indeed. You must remember it came from the late Minoan period, just after 3000 BC. Tony glanced at the dozens of glass cases, all crammed with artifacts. Is all this stuff that valuable? Oh, my, no, only the real antiquities. They're irreplaceable, of course. Kourounsis led him to another vase and began explaining its historical significance. Who gives a shit, thought Rizzoli. How much is it worth? Kourounsis sighed. King's ransom. When Tony Rizzoli left the museum that morning, he was counting riches beyond his wildest dreams. He had searched for a mule and instead found the key to a treasure house. The profits from the heroin deal paled in comparison to this, and this belonged only to him. Now all I have to do, he thought, is to figure out how to hook the fish. I'll worry about the mule later. That evening, Rizzoli took his newfound friend to a nightclub and arranged for one of the hostesses to take Kourounsis back to her hotel for the night. The next morning he stopped by the museum again. In his private office, Kourounsis blushed as he thanked Rizzoli for the previous night. Tony waved it off and invited him to a poker game that night. Some rich American tourists were in town for some gambling fun, and he was going to set them up and bilk them. At first hesitant, Kourounsis grew interested when Tony presented the possibility of earning $50,000 in one night. At length he agreed. End of side 2. The game was held in a hotel room, and Kourounsis was introduced to the players. Sal Prizzi, Perry, Murray, and Otto the dealer, and Tony's accomplice. The game began, and Rizzoli and Kourounsis won big. Victor was ecstatic as his winnings reached tens of thousands of dollars. During a break, Tony explained that they'd have to back off, let the tourists win a bit, to encourage them to keep playing. Kourounsis nodded at the logic. But he grew fearful as his pile of chips dwindled. He looked to Rizzoli for reassurance. Rizzoli nodded. Don't worry. Soon Kourounsis was broke. Rizzoli asked the men for credit, and $10,000 worth of chips were pushed in front of Kourounsis. The hands kept coming, and Kourounsis kept losing. Soon the second pile of chips had disappeared. Near hysteria, he pulled Rizzoli aside. What's going on, Tony? Don't worry. I gave Otto the signal. The game will swing back our way. The play resumed, and Tony got another $25,000 worth of chips for Kourounsis. The little man gulped. That was more than he made in 5 years. The hands became a blur, and by the end of the evening, Kourounsis was flat broke. Otto counted up the markers and informed the men that Kourounsis owed Sal Prizzi $65,000. Kourounsis almost fainted. I'll take it in cash, Sal said. I don't have that. You what? He barked. Tony Rizzoli jumped in, reassuring Sal that he'd have his money by tomorrow. The men left, grumbling, and Kourounsis mumbled, I'll just have to tell them I don't have it. Rizzoli told him this wouldn't be a good idea. Sal Prizzi had mob connections and would think nothing of killing Kourounsis for that amount. Kourounsis was frantic. What could he do? Tony shrugged. Then he had an inspiration. What about those artifacts in the museum? What if one was missing and a copy was put in its place? No, I could never do that. I'm sorry, I just thought it could save your life. Carranza stared at him. Well, how? Tony explained. He could get one of the antiquities, Carranza corrected him, out of the country, sell it, and give Pritzi the money owed. You're a good friend, Carranza said. I know. I just wish it had turned out differently. Good night, Victor. Good night, Tony. The following morning, Carranza got a call from Sal Pritzi. I'm calling about that little matter of $65,000. What time can I pick it up? Carranza began to perspire heavily. I don't have the money right now, Mr. Pritzi. There was an ominous silence at the other end of the phone. What the hell kind of game are you playing with me? I'm not playing any games. Then I want my fucking money. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Then I'll be at the museum at 6 o'clock. Have the money for me or I'll break your face in. And after that, I'm really going to hurt you. The line went dead. Carranza sat there in a panic. If only I hadn't gone to the casino that night. If only I had never met Tony Rizzoli. If only I had kept my promise to my wife never to gamble again. He shook his head to clear it. I have to do something now. At that moment, Tony Rizzoli walked into his office. Good morning, Victor. Tony Rizzoli and Victor Carranza waited for Sal Pritzi. At 7 o'clock, Sal Pritzi finally appeared. After much persuasion, Sal agreed to listen to Rizzoli's proposition. Sal frowned, then walked over to the little curator. I'm giving you 30 days. If I don't have my money by then, you're dog meat. Is that clear? Yes, sir. Pritzi turned and stalked out. Carranza sank into a chair, wiping his brow. Oh, my God, he said. I thought he was going to kill me. Don't worry, pal. We'll get you out of this. 1 hour later, Tony Rizzoli, Sal Pritzi, and the others were having drinks. The bastard pissed his pants, Rizzoli gloated. Sal Pritzi grinned. I scared him, huh? You scared me, Rizzoli said. He then explained the plan. Once the artifact was sold, they would each get their cut. It's like having a gold mine, Rizzoli thought. Once Carranza goes along with this, he's hooked. I'm going to make him clean out the whole goddamn museum. Now he had to find a way to get it out of the country, and fast. The family was waiting for him. The Athens police chiefs were gathered, discussing Tony Rizzoli. He had to be stopped before he got the heroin out of Athens. Tony Rizzoli knew he was being followed. The police were on his back. The thugs from Sicily were hanging around. He had to make a contact fast. He placed a call to Ivo Bruggi, a small-time shipowner in Rome. It was a long shot, but better than nothing. Rizzoli knew his telephone was tapped, so he made an arrangement with his neighbour to receive calls there, and he settled in to wait for Bruggi's call. For 2 whole days. The following day, Rizzoli's phone rang. Shit. He would have to be careful. Yes? Mr. Rizzoli, you came to see me at my office the other day. I turned you down. I think perhaps we should discuss it again. Spyros Lambrou. Yeah, sure. When? This afternoon at my office. Fine, I'll be there. In the lobby, a frustrated detective reported to headquarters. They knew he was going to meet someone, but they didn't know who or where. 10 minutes later, Tony Rizzoli was crawling out of a basement window leading to an alley behind the hotel. He changed taxis twice to make sure he was not being followed, and headed for Spyros Lambrou's office. At last, Spyros Lambrou had the weapon to destroy his brother-in-law. Rizzoli strode into his office. So we're going to do business together, huh? No. What? No. You will have the use of Constantin Demiris' fleet of ships. Rizzoli sank into a chair, as Lambrou explained everything about Constantin and Melina, Constantin and Noelle Page, and his plot to have them executed, and how Catherine Douglas had never really died, and Constantin had hidden her while the lovers were killed. Tony Rizzoli stared. Why are you telling me this? Because I want you to go see my brother-in-law. I have a feeling he'll be very happy to let you use his ships. There were storms raging in him over which he had no control. But Constantin Demiris enjoyed the risks he now faced. I'm a murderer, he thought. No, an executioner. And instead of being appalled by it, he found it exhilarating. Demiris received a weekly report on Catherine Alexander's activities. So far, everything was working out perfectly. According to Evelyn, she occasionally dated Kirk Reynolds. The poor girl must be desperate, Demiris thought. I owe boring Reynolds a vote of thanks. It'll be that much easier for me. Catherine was seeing Kirk Reynolds regularly and found herself drawn to him more and more. He was not handsome, but he was certainly attractive. I learned my lesson about handsome with Larry, she thought dryly. Have you thought about St. Moritz? He asked her. Catherine had given it a great deal of thought. She knew that he was in love with her. Kirk Reynolds would make a wonderful husband. Why am I hesitating? That night at dinner, Kirk said, Catherine, in case you don't know, I'm in love with you. I want to marry you. She felt a sudden panic. Kirk, my next words, Catherine thought, are going to change my life. What's holding me back? Is it the fear of the past? Kirk, why don't we go to St. Moritz? His face lit up. Does that mean... We'll see. He laughed and said quietly, I promise you it will be wonderful. The night before they were to leave, Catherine felt sick with excitement. She had known only 2 men calmly in her life, William Fraser and her husband. My God, I hope I remember how. Maybe he'll be disappointed. Evelyn reported to Demiris that Catherine had gone to St. Moritz with Kirk. There was a silence. Then he thanked her and hung up. Kirk Reynolds? It was impossible. I waited too long. I'll have to do something about this. At that moment, Anthony Rizzoli arrived. Saying he had a message from Spyros Lambrou, he was ushered into Demiris' office. You have 2 minutes, Demiris said abruptly. Rizzoli told Demiris bluntly that he wanted to charter one of his ships to transport heroin. Demiris stared, then picked up the phone to call the police. Go ahead, Rizzoli said. I'd like to tell them all about that trial of Noelle Page and Larry Douglas. 2 people executed for the murder of a woman who is still alive. Demiris paled. Then his face hardened. You're making a big mistake. You can't blackmail me. Yeah, you're my new partner. And if you say no, I go right to the police and spill the whole story. And there goes your fucking empire right down the drain. There was a long, painful silence. How? How did Spiros find out? Rizzoli grinned. That's not important. What's important is I've got you by the balls. Now you've got 60 seconds to decide whether I walk out of here as your partner or I just walk out. Constantin Demiris suddenly looked 10 years older. Well? Demiris nodded slowly. All right, he whispered. All right. You're smart. Demiris slowly rose. I'll let you get away with it this once, he said. That's as far as I'll go. It's a deal, Rizzoli said. You smuggle 1 load of heroin and you're hooked, Costa baby. Aloud he repeated, sure, it's a deal. Rizzoli was exultant. I can load up every ship of his that sails out of here, horse and antiques. He made 2 phone calls, one to Pete Luca to call off his goons. The shipment was on its way. The other to Spyros Lambrou to tell him the negotiation had been successful. I'm delighted, Mr. Rizzoli. Lambrou smiled, thinking, the narcotics squad will be too. Demiris stayed in his office past midnight, contemplating his new problem. He had revenged himself against Noelle Page, and now she was returning from the grave to haunt him. He pulled out a framed photograph of her, her beauty frozen in time. Hello, bitch. So you think you're going to destroy me? Well, we'll see. St. Moritz was an enchantment. Catherine and Kirk Reynolds checked into the Palace Hotel as Mr. and Mrs. Reynolds. Catherine was sure that everyone in the lobby was staring at her, knowing what she was doing. Their suite was simple, with a spectacular view of the mountains. Kirk took Catherine in his arms. You've made me so happy, darling. I hope so, Kirk. It's been a long time. Don't worry, I won't rush you. He's so dear, Catherine thought. But how would he feel about me if I told him about my past? She had never mentioned Larry to him, or the murder trial, or any of the terrible things that had happened to her. She wanted to feel close to him, to confide in him, but something held her back. She turned and began to unpack, slowly, stalling. Kirk called her from the other room. Oh no, she thought. He wants to go to bed. Why don't we go outside and look around? Catherine went limp with relief. What's wrong with me, she wondered. I'm panicking. They dressed warmly and went outside. Catherine still unable to relax and enjoy the surroundings, and the man beside her. They wandered around the town, had a lovely lunch, and Catherine found herself enjoying everything. She looked at Kirk and thought, I'm going to make you so happy tonight. Yes, tonight. That evening they dined in an elegant restaurant. Unaccountably, Catherine found herself thinking incessantly about Larry. She pushed the memories from her mind and concentrated on Kirk. After dinner, Catherine's heart was pounding as they headed to their room. He's going to say, let's go right to bed. And why shouldn't he? That's what I came here for, isn't it? I can't pretend I came for the skiing. Catherine, are you worried about anything? Of course not. Good. Let's get undressed and go to bed. Catherine looked at the bed. It was the largest she had ever seen, and it seemed to take up the whole room. Kathy? She thought, I'm going to get undressed, and I'm going to get into bed, and I'm going to disappoint you. I'm not in love with you, Kirk. I can't sleep with you. Kirk, forgive me, but I can't. I'm sorry. He forced a smile. I said I'd be patient. I understand. We can still have a wonderful time here. She kissed his cheek gratefully. Oh, Kirk, thank you. I don't know what's the matter with me. Kirk agreeably moved onto the living room couch, and Catherine settled into the bed. Will I ever be able to make love with another man? Or has Larry burned that out of me? Maybe in a way Larry did manage to kill me after all. Kirk Reynolds was awakened in the middle of the night by the screams. He rushed into the bedroom, moved to Catherine's side, and tried to calm her down. They tried to drown me, she gasped. It was only a dream, he said. No, it was real. And at last she told Kirk the truth about Larry and Noelle Page, and their execution for their attempts to kill her. Wait a minute, there's no death sentence for attempted murder. There's some mistake. I'll call a friend of mine in Athens in the morning. He works for the state. His name is Peter Demiris. Catherine was still asleep when Kirk Reynolds awakened. He dressed and went into the bedroom and looked down at Catherine. I love her so much. I have to find out what really happened and clear the shadows away for her. Kirk went down to the lobby and placed a call to Athens. He asked Peter Demiris for clarification on a point of law. Execution for attempted murder. There was a silence then. May I ask why you are inquiring? He told Demiris of Catherine's story, and Demiris was thoughtful. Where are you staying? I'll look into this, I promise. Catherine and Kirk breakfasted in the village. Then Kirk led her to the ski slopes for her first lessons. When the lessons were underway, Kirk said goodbye and headed off for the steeper runs. To Catherine's surprise, the lessons were fun. She was nervous in the beginning, and finally found her balance and began to sail along. At lunch, she was exhilarated, and Kirk decided not to tell her about the phone call to Peter Demiris. He didn't want to disturb her mood. After lunch, she decided to go back to the room for a nap. Kirk wanted to try his luck with the steepest slope, Grisha. He kissed her gently and headed back. Catherine watched him walk away and thought, he's a wonderful man. I wonder what he sees in an idiot like me. Catherine slept all afternoon and woke at 6. She bathed and dressed, thinking of the night ahead. I'll make it up to him, she vowed. At 7 o'clock, Kirk Reynolds had still not returned. She decided to see if he was in the bar, when the phone rang. A voice told her that there had been a bad accident. Catherine could not breathe. He's dead, Mrs. Reynolds. He was skiing the Grisha and broke his neck. Tony Rizzoli was awakened by a pounding on his door. It was his hotel neighbor, telling him he had a call. Rizzoli stumbled across the hall and picked up the phone. You have a problem, Mr. Rizzoli. The voice told him that Spyros Lambrou wanted Rizzoli to know that one of Demiris' ships was being diverted from Athens on Sunday, and that Demiris planned to be on it. He was going to hide out in the US until he could get rid of Rizzoli. That sneaky son of a bitch, he thought. Thank Mr. Lambrou for me. He hung up, pleased. He had Constantin Demiris running. Sunday. He had 2 days to lay his plans. Rizzoli knew he had to be careful. He was being followed everywhere. From a phone booth, he called Victor Caronsis. Victor, it's Tony. You know that pretty red vase? The cat amphora? Yeah, I'm going to pick it up tonight. After some hesitation, Choronsis agreed. All he had to do, Rizzoli said, was to substitute a copy for the real vase and take the original home in a paper bag with a receipt. He was to leave the bag in a taxi that would be waiting for him. And Rizzoli would take care of the rest. I've never done anything like this, Tony. I know. Neither have I. You're a good friend, Tony, the best I ever had. Once this is over, you won't have any more worries. And neither will I, Rizzoli thought exultantly. Victor Choronsis watched the museum crowds nervously, apprehensive of what he had to do. The vase that Tony had asked him to steal was one of the museum's great treasures. It was from the 15th century BC, and the last time he had touched it had been 15 years earlier, when he had reverently placed it in its case. And now I'm stealing it, Choronsis thought. God help me. A few minutes before 6, he went to the museum curio shop and purchased a copy of the amphora. He took the object, the receipt, and returned to his office. Trembling with indecision, he almost gave it up. Then he thought of Sal Prizzi and knew the man would kill him. He left the office and went to the case. He took out his key and stared at the vase. It was so utterly exquisite. It was a piece of history, something that could never be replaced. Choronsis took a breath and exchanged the original for the replica. To him it screamed fake, but he knew that it would pass all but the most expert scrutiny. He placed the original carefully in the paper bag and locked the case. Wiping the perspiration from his face, he went downstairs and handed the bag to the guard for inspection. Choronsis nodded to the man, then left the museum, fighting his nausea. He was betraying his country, stealing a piece of history and selling it to some faceless foreigner. He headed for the taxi that was waiting for him. He slumped in the seat. When the taxi arrived at the predetermined place, Choronsis got out, took one last look at the precious package, then went into the hotel. A man entered the taxi immediately, and it sped away. So, it was done, Choronsis thought. The nightmare is over. Taking circuitous routes, Rizzoli finally managed to elude the detectives who were tailing him. He headed for the harbour where Demiris' boat lay at anchor. Setting 2 of his guards on the dock, he boarded and asked for Demiris. He was led to Demiris' huge cabin and announced himself. Demiris leapt to his feet. "What are you doing here?" Rizzoli smiled. "Are you planning on taking a trip without saying goodbye to your partner?" "No, of course not." Rizzoli moved close to Demiris. "You and I have a deal, remember? And people who welch on deals die real bad." Demiris offered him money, more than he could dream of. Rizzoli merely laughed. What he wanted was Demiris' tankers, all of them, and to prevent any more surprises, Rizzoli was going to stay on board, with his heroine, and with a treasure from the State Museum. Demiris was silent. There was nothing he could do. At midnight, the ship sailed. Tony Rizzoli had the ship's radio torn out, just in case Demiris tried to radio for help. Demiris stayed in his cabin all that day and that night. After dinner, Rizzoli went up to check on him. He found Demiris pale and drawn, and Rizzoli grinned in satisfaction. He checked in with the captain and informed him that the ship would be making an unscheduled stop off the coast of Florida. The captain nodded. They would reach Florida in approximately 3 weeks. Rizzoli smiled. He'd enjoy the vacation. The days passed, and soon they neared the American continent. They hit heavy weather, and Rizzoli stayed in his bunk to ride it out. His dreams were violent, dark. There was an explosion. He woke, disoriented. The cabin was rocking. Men were running madly outside. He went out to find that the ship was on fire and sinking. "We'll radio for help." Then he remembered the radio had been torn out. The ship was low in the water, too late for lifeboats. Then Rizzoli heard it, a whirring sound. A helicopter hovered 10 feet above the ship. He waved frantically at the helicopter. A face appeared at the window. It was Constantin Demiris. He was smiling, and he was holding up the priceless amphora. Rizzoli stared. Then it hit him. The son of a bitch planned the whole thing. He had laid his trap to get him on the ship, and Rizzoli had leapt into it. The tanker sank quickly, and the cold water lapped at Rizzoli's feet, then his knees. "Come back, I'll give you anything." The last thing Tony Rizzoli saw was the helicopter zooming away toward the moon. In St. Moritz, Catherine was in a state of shock, numbed by Kirk's death. He had skied down a run that had been closed. Somehow the sign had been blown down by the wind. All the people die around me, she thought. Larry and now Kirk. And there were others. Noelle, Napoleon Chotas, Frederick Stavros. It was an unending nightmare. The trip back to London was grief-stricken. She had come with Kirk, filled with hope for a new life. I should have made love to him, she thought. I'm under some kind of curse. I destroy everyone who comes near me. She was too depressed to go back to work. On Evelyn's advice, she sought out a psychiatrist, one who had helped Vim from time to time. She went to see Dr. Alan Hamilton the following Friday. Evelyn considered ringing Constantin Demiris to tell him about it, but decided it was too unimportant to bother him. Catherine arrived at Dr. Hamilton's apprehensive about the visit. When she reached the reception area, she told the woman she'd decided to cancel, but would pay for the appointment. The receptionist called the doctor, and a moment later Alan Hamilton came out. He was in his early 40s, tall and blonde, and had an easy manner. Within minutes he'd made Catherine feel at ease, and she agreed to come in and sit down. She noticed in his office a photograph of a beautiful woman with a young boy. "So he has a nice family. What does that prove?" "So, I understand you've been through a lot," he said sympathetically. "What do you know about it?" Catherine snapped. Her tone was angrier than she'd intended. "I spoke with Evelyn. She told me what happened at St. Moritz. I'm sorry." That damn word again. "Are you? If you're such a wonderful doctor, maybe you can bring Kirk back to life." All the misery that had been pent up inside her broke, erupting in a torrent, and to her horror, Catherine found that she was sobbing hysterically. "Leave me alone," she screamed. "Leave me alone." Alan Hamilton sat there watching her, saying nothing. Finally her sobs subsided, and she said wearily, "I'm sorry, forgive me, I really must go now." She rose and started toward the door. "Miss Alexander, I don't know whether I can help you, but I'd like to try. I can promise only that whatever I do won't hurt you." Catherine stood at the door, undecided. She turned to look at him, her eyes filled with tears. "I don't know what's the matter with me," she whispered. "I feel so lost." Alan Hamilton rose and walked over to her. "Then why don't we try to find out? We'll work on it together." She looked at him and nodded. There was something reassuring in his manner, and she felt calmed by him. She sat back down, and he asked her quietly about Kirk's death. It was so painful to talk about. "Yes, he was on a slope that was supposed to have been closed. The wind blew the sign down." "Is this your first encounter with the death of someone close to you?" How was she supposed to answer that? "Oh no, my husband and his mistress were executed for trying to murder me. Everyone round me dies." That would shake him up. He was sitting there waiting for an answer. The smug son of a bitch. Well, she wouldn't give him the satisfaction. Her life was none of his business. "I hate him." Alan Hamilton saw the anger in her face and deliberately changed the subject. "How's Vim?" he asked. The question threw Catherine completely off guard. "Vim is fine. Can you explain to me why he is like he is?" "Vim came to me because he kept losing jobs. He's something very rare, a genuine misanthrope. I can't go into the reasons why, but basically he hates people. He is unable to relate to other people." Catherine nodded. How well she knew. When their time was up, Dr. Hamilton suggested setting another appointment. He glanced at his schedule. It was completely full. He suggested his lunch hour. Catherine was carrying an unbearable burden, and he was determined to do everything he could to help her. Dr. Hamilton watched her walk away and thought, "She's so vulnerable and so beautiful. I have to be careful." He looked at the photograph on his desk. "I wonder what Angela would think." Constantin Demiris received the call in the middle of the night telling him of his ship's accident. There were no survivors. He would file an insurance claim. He would keep the vase in his private collection. Now it was time to punish his brother-in-law. Spyros Lambrou waited anxiously for the news of Constantin Demiris' arrest, but no word had come. He had informed U.S. Customs the moment the ship had sailed, but there had been no word. The telephone rang. It was Constantin Demiris. Lambrou froze. It was impossible. "Spiros, how are you?" "Fine. Where are you?" "In Athens. Are you free for lunch today?" "Yes, fine." "Good. 2:00 at the club." When Demiris finally arrived, 30 minutes late, Spiros studied him carefully for any sign of his recent experiences. Nothing. They ordered, and Spiros had a terrible premonition. Demiris was much too cheerful. Demiris thanked Spiros for sending him Tony Rizzoli. "But he had an accident, Spiros." He leaned forward. "The way anyone who tries to double-cross me has an accident. You tried to destroy me," he hissed. "But it would have been better if you had succeeded." "I don't know what you're talking about." "Don't you? You will soon. But first I'm going to destroy your sister." Their food arrived. "Enjoy your lunch," Demiris said. Constantin Demiris thought about the meeting with satisfaction. He knew how Spiros adored his sister, and Demiris intended to punish both of them. But there was something he had to take care of first. Catherine Alexander. He had to move quickly now. As long as she was alive, someone could prove what Demiris had done. He dialed a number. "I'll be in Kowloon Monday. Be there." He hung up. "It must look like an accident." "Can you arrange that?" Constantin Demiris asked. It was an insult. That was a question you asked some bum you picked up from the streets. He could feel the anger rising in him, but he said nothing. Demiris outlined his plans. A delegation of executives were heading for London the next week. This man would be sent along with them. "One thing more. I don't want anyone to be able to identify her body." Constantin Demiris called Catherine and told her of the executives who would soon be arriving. He asked her to help them personally, and she agreed. He thanked her and hung up. "Goodbye, Catherine." So that was done. With Catherine Alexander gone, there would be no more loose ends. Now he could turn his full attention to his wife and her brother. The delegation arrived in London the following morning. There were 3 of them, all of different nationalities. The American, Jerry Haley, was a tall, muscular man with the largest hands Catherine had ever seen. The Frenchman, Yves Renard, was short and stout and seemed wary of everything. The third, Dino Matusi, was a charming, ingratiating Italian. Catherine greeted them warmly and showed them to their offices. There was a sudden crash. A young boy carrying the men's suitcases had dropped one. He apologized, and Evelyn explained that this was Athanas Stavros, and had been sent from the Athens office to work here. Catherine nodded and took the 3 men to meet everyone. When the men met Vim, they had exactly the same reaction that Catherine had. Who was this man? He watched Catherine, thinking, "She's much prettier than I expected. That will make it more interesting. I'm going to enjoy this very much." Later, Catherine heard the Frenchman screaming at the young boy. Afterward, she called Athanas to her office. Frightened, he entered and sat down. "Athanas, I want you to know that I support you, and if anyone gives you any trouble, you come to me, all right?" The boy nodded silently. Catherine watched him, then dismissed him. She wondered about his past. Someone, somewhere, had broken his spirit. Catherine showed the executives round, answering their questions, but was puzzled by the Italian, Dino Matusi. He asked questions for which he should have known the answers, and seemed more interested in Catherine's personal life than anything else, but she successfully kept him at bay. That afternoon, Catherine had her second appointment with Dr. Hamilton. She had actually been looking forward to it, she realized. Dr. Hamilton was waiting for her. "Well, did you have a good week?" Was it a good week? Not really. She had been unable to get Kirk Reynolds' death out of her mind. "It was all right. I keep busy." "That's very helpful." He asked her about her work. Did she enjoy it? She shrugged. And as she told him about Constantin Demiris, she found herself telling him about Larry. "My husband used to work for Mr. Demiris. He was his pilot. I had a boating accident and I lost my memory. When I regained it, Mr. Demiris offered me this job. I'm leaving out the pain and the terror. Am I ashamed to tell him my husband tried to murder me? Is it because I'm afraid he'll think me less worthwhile? It isn't easy for any of us to talk about our pasts. Catherine looked at him, silent. You said you lost your memory. Yes. You had a boating accident. Yes. Catherine's lips were stiff, as though she were determined to tell him as little as possible. She was torn with the terrible conflict. She wanted to tell him everything and get his help. She wanted to tell him nothing and to be left alone. Alan Hamilton studied her thoughtfully. Are you divorced? Yes, by a firing squad, she thought. My husband died. After a silence, he said, Catherine, what are you afraid of? She took a deep breath. People around me seem to die. And you think you're the cause of their deaths? Yes. No, I don't know. She poured it out. My husband was killed and his mistress, the two lawyers who defended them died. And now, Kirk. Catherine, you're innocent. You had nothing to do with any of those deaths. You must understand that. She sat there, wanting to believe it. Alan Hamilton watched her quietly. Catherine looked up and thought, he's a decent man. I wish I'd met him earlier. Guiltily, she looked at the photograph on his desk. Thank you, she said. I'll try and get used to that idea. He smiled, and they set an appointment for the next week. When she had gone, Alan Hamilton sat thinking about her. He was too good a psychiatrist to let himself be tempted, he thought. It would have been a betrayal. Dr. Hamilton had been a surgeon, an excellent one, and then the Second World War had begun. He worked behind the lines endlessly, saving countless lives as the wounded poured in. The bombs were raining as he worked on a patient, and he ignored the calls to leave for the air raid shelters. He never heard the bomb that fell on the building. He was in a coma for 6 days, and he learned that his right hand had been crushed. It would heal, but he would never operate again. After a year of therapy, his psychiatrist urged him to get on with his life. He was a healer. If he couldn't heal bodies, why not heal people's minds, the doctor asked. It was the most rewarding decision he had ever made, and something in Catherine had touched him. I must help her. As Catherine returned to the office, she thought, I feel as though I've found a new friend. I wonder how long he's been married. Athens. Lambrou was frantic. What had gone wrong with Rizzoli? All that mattered now was warning his sister. He left to see Melina. Spiros, you sounded so upset on the phone. What's wrong? We have to talk. He led her to a bench and they sat. You're alarming me. I mean to. Your life is in danger. I think Costa is going to try to kill you. You're joking. Costa couldn't. He's killed before. What? I don't believe it. He told her about Catherine Douglas and how Demiris had hidden her away while Larry Douglas and Noel Page were executed for her murder. Melina was stunned. She remembered seeing Catherine in the house. I saw her here, Spiros. He's insane. I want you to leave this place. No, this is my home. Molina. I can handle him, Spiros. Then promise me you won't be alone with him. I promise. Melina had no intention of keeping that promise. Melina was waiting for Demiris that night. We need to talk. I have an engagement. Are you planning to murder someone else tonight? He turned. What are you raving about? She told him what she knew about Larry Douglas and Noel Page and Catherine Douglas. No one will believe you. I've sent someone to get rid of Catherine Douglas. He moved closer to her and said softly, I'm really getting quite fed up with you and your brother. He squeezed her arm hard. I'm getting a divorce, but I won't be out of your life. Oh, no. But I must go change now. It's not polite to keep a lady waiting. He turned and walked away. Melina stood there, her heart pounding. Spiros was right. He's a madman. She wasn't afraid for her own life. What do I have to live for? She thought bitterly. I'm ready to die, but I can't let him harm Spiros. The executors from Athens were keeping Catherine busy. She learned more about each individual. Jerry Haley was the black sheep of his family. Jailed for auto theft and rape, he had since straightened his life out and become a successful businessman. Yves Renard was a bitter man, abandoned by his parents. He had run away from his abusive relatives and fled to Paris at 15. Dina Matusi, at 16, had run away with an older married woman and had been sent away from home to avoid scandal. He was evasive about when he had gone to work for Demiris and turned the conversation back to Catherine. He watched her, listened to her. He wanted to know everything about her. He wondered what her body was like. He would know soon, very soon. Jerry Haley invited her to the theatre, and she accepted, albeit hesitantly, as she thought of those huge hands of his and his history. Afterward, Catherine made excuses and went home early. Yves Renard was interested in museums and suggested they visit some together. Catherine agreed, out of duty. He's so bitter, she thought. As they passed through the exhibits, Catherine realized that Renard was barely paying attention. She wondered why he had asked her to come. On the way back, he thanked her and asked her to accompany him to Stonehenge next week. She nodded, wondering why he bothered. Dina Matusi was a gourmet and whisked Catherine off to dinner. He was his usual aggressive self, and Catherine could hardly keep from smiling at his lack of subterfuge. She accepted his invitation to drive into the country the following week. He really was quite harmless, she thought. Catherine was impressed with Atanas Stavich. The boy was the hardest worker she had ever seen, and she resolved to try and build his self-confidence. "You know the kid is in love with you, don't you?" Evelyn said one day. "Who?" "Atanas. He follows you like a lost sheep." Catherine laughed, but on impulse later invited Atanas to lunch. Surprised, the boy accepted. At lunch, Catherine watched as Atanas put away a huge meal. She asked him about his background. He had worked for Demiris in Athens, he said, with a trace of bitterness in his voice. She pressed him, and finally the boy said, "I do not think Mr. Demiris is a nice man. Never mind." Catherine let it go, then asked him what his plans were. "I want to be a doctor." He explained he came from war-torn Macedonia and wanted only to be able to heal people. He had lost his entire family, but there were others he could help. Catherine nodded, impressed, and she decided to talk to Alan Hamilton to see if he could help. At midnight, a bomb exploded in Spyros Lambrou's villa. 2 servants were dead, but Spiros and his wife were unharmed, as they had attended a last-minute dinner with friends. "Who would do a thing like this to you?" Molina asked him. "Costa. You have no proof. I don't need any. Don't you understand yet what you are married to?" He begged her to leave, and at last she nodded. "All right, Spiros. I will do what I must." Melina sat in her bedroom all that day. So it was true. She had to warn Catherine Douglas, but she also had to destroy Costa. But how? Then the answer came. Of course, she thought. It's the only way. In her next session with Alan Hamilton, Catherine expressed feelings of unease about the delegates from Athens. And she had had her nightmare again. Except this time she was in the convent, and it was Constantin Demiris who visited her and had given her the gold bird pin. Alan calmed her fears. And then she told him about Atanas Stavich and his dream of becoming a doctor. Then she suddenly remembered something else. In her dream, Demiris had said to her, "He's going to kill you." He lay on his bed, thinking about how he was going to kill her. He found he was getting aroused. Death was the ultimate orgasm. Finally, he knew how he was going to do it. Demiris would be pleased. End of side 3. Demiris arrived at his beach house at 7 p.m., surprised to see it surrounded by police cars. Inside it was a shambles. A great struggle had obviously taken place. "Where is my wife? I was to meet her here." "She's not here," said Lieutenant Theophilos. "We've been looking for her. It looks like the house has been burglarized." He held up her watch, which had been smashed, and then a knife covered in blood. "Is she dead?" he asked. "It's a possibility, sir. Luckily, we got some clear fingerprints on the knife." "Then you'll catch whoever did it," Demiris said. The man nodded, explaining that they had to sort out the prints in the house, and that Demiris needed to give his. He nodded, dazed. He was fingerprinted. The lieutenant held up a detective's business card. Did Demiris know anything about this? He shook his head. He thanked Demiris and went about his business. Melina, the golden girl. It had been so wonderful at first, and then she had murdered their son. And for that, there could never be forgiveness, only her death. The next day, Demiris was called down to police headquarters. He was led into a room with 6 men, who had questions for him. There were some discrepancies. The maid had told them that she'd overheard Molina making a date with Costa at the beach house for 3 p.m., yet Costa had said 7. And he said that he was going to divorce Molina, yet the maid overheard Molina say that it was she who was initiating the divorce. And they had found some swimming trunks. The detectives held them up. Did he recognize them? Yes. They're mine. They were wet with fresh seawater, and the spots on them were blood. Someone must have put them on. But why, Mr. Demiris? That's what's bothering us. And they had found a gold button at the beach house, one which matched one of Demiris' jackets. They had contacted the detective, and Melina had hired him to protect her from Demiris. What? Demiris was shocked. They explained Melina had told Demiris she wanted a divorce, and he had threatened to kill her. The chief inspector pulled out the blood-stained knife. It was Demiris' fingerprints they had found on it. His mind was racing. "Don't you see, it's a frame-up," he shouted. "She set it all up. She's probably laughing at me right now." "I wish that were true, sir," the special prosecutor said. "We pulled her body out of the sea this morning. She had been stabbed and drowned. I'm placing you under arrest, Mr. Demiris, for the murder of your wife." In the beginning, Melina had no idea how she was going to accomplish it. Somehow Costa had to be stopped. Think like Costa. And she had. By morning, Melina had worked out all the details. After that, the rest had been simple. Melina had brought a package to Demiris to open with a large butcher knife. He did so, grudgingly. "Costa, must we go on this way?" "Don't you understand? It's over. I'm sick of you." Quietly, she said, "All right, have it your way." She left the room, carrying the knife carefully by the blade. Melina had gone into Demiris' closet and selected a jacket that had just come back from the cleaners and tore a gold button from it. Then she took a pair of his swimming trunks with his initials on them. "I'm almost ready," she thought. She went to Catalano's detective agency to hire protection from her husband. Catalanos listened to her story, thinking, this woman's neurotic. But meanwhile, he would accept her check. The man could start Monday, she said. Catalanos shrugged and handed her his business card. When Melina returned home, she phoned her brother. "Spiros, I have good news. Costa wants a truce. He wants to meet you at your lodge in Acrocorinth at 3 o'clock this afternoon." "That's a 3-hour drive." "If it's going to mean peace, Spiros." "All right, but I'm doing it for you." "For us," Melina said. "Goodbye, Spiros." "Goodbye." Then she phoned Constantin at the office. He was abrupt. She told him that Spiros wanted peace and would meet him at the lodge at 3 p.m. Demiris snorted. But when Melina added that Spiros wanted to sell him his fleet, he was interested. "All right, I'll be there." The drive to Acrocorinth was a long one. Lambrou was the first to arrive, wondering what was in store. Was this another of Demiris' tricks? He'd wait and see. 15 minutes later, Demiris arrived, with a glow of satisfaction. So Lambrou was willing to concede defeat. He went inside, and the 2 men faced each other. "I want this madness to end, Costa. It's gone too far. I couldn't agree more. How many ships do you have, Spiros? Lambrou was stunned, and it quickly became apparent that the two men had been sent up on a wild goose chase by Melina. Demiris stormed out. Lambrou watched, thinking, Melina shouldn't have lied to us. It's too late. At 2 o'clock, Melina ordered tea. When the maid arrived, she was on the phone, arguing with Costa. In fact, the line was dead. She would have her divorce, she said, but she would meet him at the beach house in an hour. She hung up, telling the maid that if she didn't return by 6 o'clock to call the police. There was one more thing to do. Catherine Alexander had to be warned. She called the London office, but Catherine was not in. She asked for Wim van Dien, whom she had heard was a genius with an incredible memory. I have a message for Catherine Alexander. Please tell her that her life is in danger. Someone is going to try and kill her. I think it is someone from Athens. Athens has a population of 8... Melina could not make the man understand. She hung up the phone. She had tried her best. Wim sat at his desk, digesting the conversation. Someone is trying to kill Catherine. 114 murders were committed in England this year. Catherine will make it 115. Someone from Athens. Jerry Haley? Yves Renard? Dina Matusi? He thought for a moment. I think I know which one it is. When Catherine returned later, Wim said nothing about the phone call. He was curious to see if he was right. Catherine went out with one of the men every night, and when she came to work each morning, Wim seemed disappointed to see her. When is she going to let him do it, he wondered. Maybe he should tell her about the telephone message. But that would be cheating. It wouldn't be fair to change the odds. The drive to the beach house took Melina back through 20 years of memories. She and Costa, young and in love, then the miscarriage, and the string of mistresses, then the affair with Noel Page, his taunts. Why don't you just kill yourself? And finally the threat to destroy Spiros. That, in the end, was what Melina was unable to bear. She walked into the comforting, friendly house and looked around for the last time. Then she began overturning furniture and smashing lamps. She took the detective's card and laid it on a table, then lifted the rug and put the button under it. Next, she took off her gold wristwatch and smashed it against the table. She took the swim trunks, wet them in the ocean, and returned to the house. There was only one thing left to do. It's time, she thought. She unwrapped the butcher knife. This was the crucial part. She had to stab herself hard enough to make it look like murder, and still have enough strength left to carry out the rest of her plan. She closed her eyes and plunged the knife deep into her side. The pain was excruciating. Melina held the trunks to her side, and when they were covered with blood, she pushed them into a closet. She grew dizzy. She looked around to make sure she hadn't missed anything, then stumbled toward the beach, her blood staining the carpet a bright crimson. I'm not going to make it, she thought. I mustn't let Costa win. Step by step, she moved toward the ocean. She kept fighting, then fell to her knees. She stood, wavering, then moved toward the water. The cold water lapped at her feet. Then the salt water hit her wound. She screamed with the unbearable pain. I'm doing it for Spiros. Dear Spiros. In the distance, a cloud hung low. She swam toward it, trailing a stream of blood. Then the cloud descended on her, enveloping her, caressing her. The pain was gone now, and she felt a wonderful feeling of peace. I'm going home, Melina thought happily. I'm going home at last. Demiris was booked, photographed and jailed. How dare they do this to him? Get me Peter Dimonides. Mr. Dimonides is under investigation. So there was no one to turn to. He called the special prosecutor and told the man he had an alibi for 3 o'clock when Melina had died. Spyros Lambrou arrived. Demiris' face lit up when he saw him. Spiros, tell these idiots I didn't murder Melina. Tell them about our meeting at 3 o'clock yesterday. Spiros stared at him. What meeting? The blood drained from Demiris' face. You must be confused, Costa. I was alone yesterday. I'm not going to lie for you. The truth is that my sister is dead and you murdered her. Liar, Demiris screamed. It took 2 policemen to restrain him. And then he realized that only one man could have saved him. Napoleon Chotas. Catherine told Alan Hamilton that she had been having premonitions, and her feelings of unease were growing about the men from Athens. And she had had a dream about Constantin Demiris. She couldn't remember much, but she had woken screaming. Dr. Hamilton studied the transcript of the session carefully, looking for clues. What was disturbing Catherine so deeply? He realized he had become attached to Catherine. As hard as he tried, his thoughts kept returning to her. Catherine was unable to get Alan Hamilton out of her mind. Don't be a fool, she thought. He's a married man. All patients feel this way about their analysts. But nothing Catherine told herself helped. Maybe I should see an analyst about my analyst. She thought about cancelling her upcoming appointment before she got in any deeper. Too late. On the morning she had an appointment with Alan, Catherine dressed very carefully and went to the beauty parlour. As long as I'm not going to see him again after today, she reasoned, there's no harm in my looking nice. The moment she walked into his office, her resolve melted. Why does he have to be so damned attractive? Why couldn't we have met before he got married? Why couldn't he have known me when I was a normal and sane human being? But on the other hand, if I were a sane, normal human being, I wouldn't have gone to him in the first place, would I? Now was the time to tell him that this was her last visit. Alan, and her resolve broke. She looked at the photograph. How long have you been married? Oh, that's my sister and her son. A feeling of joy swept over Catherine. That's wonderful. I mean, she looks wonderful. Are you all right, Catherine? I'm fine. You're not married? No. Will you have dinner with me? Will you take me to bed? Will you marry me? If she said any of these things aloud, he would really think she was crazy. Maybe I am. He was watching her, frowning. Catherine, I'm afraid we're not going to be able to go on with these sessions. Today will be our last day. Catherine's heart sank. Why? Have I done something to... No, it isn't you. In a professional relationship of this kind, it's improper for a doctor to become emotionally involved with a patient. Her eyes were glowing. Are you saying that you're becoming emotionally involved with me? Yes, and because of that, I'm afraid... You're absolutely right, she said happily. Let's talk about it at dinner tonight. They dined at a little Italian restaurant in the heart of Soho. The food could have been great or terrible, it made no difference. They were totally absorbed in each other. It isn't fair, Alan, Catherine said. You know everything about me. Tell me about yourself. Weren't you ever married? No, I was engaged to be married. What happened? It was during the war. We were living together in a small flat. It was during the days of the Blitz. I was working at the hospital. And when I came home one night, Catherine could hear the pain in his voice. The building was gone. There was nothing left. She put her hand over his. I'm sorry. It took a long time to get over it. I never met anyone else that I wanted to marry. And his eyes said, until now. They sat there for hours, talking about everything. The theatre, medicine, the state of the world. But the real conversation was unspoken. It was the electricity building up between them. They could both feel it. There was a sexual tension between them that was overwhelming. Finally, Alan brought up the subject. Catherine, what I said this morning about the doctor-patient relationship. Tell me about it at your flat, she whispered. They undressed quickly and eagerly, and as Catherine took off her clothes, she thought of how she had felt when she was with Kirk Reynolds and how different it was now. The difference is being in love, Catherine thought. I'm in love with this man. She lay on the bed waiting for him, and when he came to her and put his arms around her, all the worries, all the fears of never being able to relate to a man vanished. They stroked each other's bodies, exploring tenderly, then fiercely, until their needs became wild and desperate, and they joined together and Catherine screamed aloud with sheer happiness. I'm whole again, she thought. Thank you. They lay there, spent, and Catherine held Alan close in her arms, never wanting to let him go. When she could speak again, she said in a shaky voice, You certainly know how to treat a patient, Doctor. Catherine learned about the arrest of Constantin Demiris for the murder of his wife from the headlines. It came as a complete shock. When she got to the office, there was a pall over everything. Constantin Demiris was the most important prisoner the Central Prison of Athens had ever held. However, his extraordinary demands, telephones, telex machines, couriers, were denied. He spent most of his waking hours trying to figure out who had murdered Melina. In the beginning, Demiris had assumed that a burglar had been surprised by Melina while ransacking the beach house and had killed her. But the moment the police had confronted him with the evidence against him, Demiris had realized that he was being framed. The question was, by whom? The logical person was Spyros Lambrou, but the trouble with that theory was that Lambrou loved his sister more than anyone in the world. He never would have harmed her. His suspicions then turned to the gang that Tony Rizzoli had been involved with. Perhaps they had learned what he had done to Rizzoli, and this was their way of getting revenge. Constantin Demiris had dismissed that idea out of hand. If the mafia had wanted revenge, they would simply have put out a contract on him. And so, sitting alone in his cell, Demiris had gone round and round, trying to solve the puzzle of what had happened. In the end, when he had exhausted all the possibilities, there was only one possible answer. Melina had committed suicide and framed him for her death. Demiris thought of what he had done to Noel Page and Larry Douglas, and the bitter irony was that now he was in the same position they had been. He was going to be tried for a murder he had not committed. Demiris met with his lawyer, a man named Vasiliki. He was a first-rate criminal attorney, but was that going to be good enough? Vasiliki was not encouraging. The evidence was overwhelming, and bail had been denied. Mr. Demiris, do you have any idea who killed your wife? No one. My wife committed suicide. The attorney stared at him. I'm afraid that won't be a strong enough defense. And with a sinking heart, Demiris knew that there was not a jury in the world that would have believed his story. The following morning, the attorney had more bad news. Spyros Lambrou had gone to the police and told them that Catherine Douglas was still alive. Demiris paled. He had forgotten about Catherine. The matter had now become urgent. He sent a message immediately to London. The man from Athens read the message twice, and he felt the beginnings of a sexual stirring that always happened to him before he took care of a contract. He'd have to move fast. Tonight. Alan Hamilton held his usual session with Wim van Dien. He asked how things at the office were, and Wim said he hated everyone there. What about Catherine Alexander? She won't be working there anymore. What do you mean? She's going to be murdered. She told me. Catherine told you? No, the other one. Mrs. Demiris. Who's going to murder Catherine? One of the men from Athens. Wim, I have to leave now. Okay. That evening, Catherine had plans to see a movie with Jerry Haley. As she was leaving, her phone rang. Hello? Catherine? It was Alan. You're in great danger. I believe someone is trying to kill you. She moaned. Her worst nightmares were coming true. Who? I don't know. But don't leave the office. Don't talk to anyone. I'm coming to get you. Lock yourself in. Alan, I'm on my way. The line went dead. Oh, my God. Atanas appeared in the doorway. What's wrong, Miss Alexander? Someone is trying to kill me. He stared. Why? Who would want to do that? I'm not sure. They heard a knock at the front door. Don't let anyone in, she said. Dr. Hamilton's on his way. You could hide in the basement, Atanas whispered. You'll be safe there. Right. They headed downstairs, and Catherine asked Atanas to tell Dr. Hamilton where she was when he arrived. They went into the basement, and Atanas asked, Do you know who would want to kill you? I really don't know. Atanas turned and whispered, I think I know. Catherine stared. Who? Me, Catherine. Suddenly a switchblade was at her throat. Atanas, this is no time to play. The knife pressed deeper into her throat. Did you ever read An Appointment in Samara, Catherine? No? Well, it's too late now, isn't it? It's about someone who tried to escape death. He went to Samara, and death was waiting for him there. This is your Samara, Catherine. It was obscene listening to these terrifying words coming from the mouth of this innocent-looking boy. Atanas, you can't. He slapped her hard. I can't because I'm a boy. I'm 30 years old, Catherine. I look so small because when I was growing up I never had enough to eat. He backed her up against a wall. When I was 7, I watched the Turks rape my mother and father and then slash them both to death. Then they raped me and left me for dead. Atanas, I've never hurt you. He smiled his boyish smile. This is business. You're worth 50,000 to me, dead. Everything suddenly went hazy. Atanas slit open the front of her dress. Pretty, he said. I was planning a party first, but since your doctor friend is coming, we won't have time. Too bad. I'm a great lover. Catherine could hardly breathe. Atanas pulled out a bottle of whiskey and took a drink. Catherine was tempted to flee, but Atanas merely smiled. Try it, please. He forced her to one of the heavy wooden posts that supported the ceiling and shoved her to the ground. Atanas cut 2 lengths of cord from a pile of rope and told her to put her hands behind her, around the post. She hesitated, and he slammed his fist against her temple. The room blurred, and Atanas whispered, Do what I say before I slice your fucking head off. He lashed her hands together tightly, then her ankles. Satisfied, he drained the bottle. Maybe he'll get drunk and fall asleep, Catherine thought desperately. He put the bottle on the cement floor, then said, Time to go to work. What are you going to do? I'm going to make a little accident. This is going to be a masterpiece. I may even charge Demiris double. Demiris? So it wasn't just a dream. He was behind this, but why? Atanas moved to the huge boiler, examined it, then jammed the safety valve closed. He then turned up the heat dial to the maximum. I'm afraid this old boiler's going to explode after all. When that dial reaches 400 degrees, the boiler will blow up. The gas lines will rip open and the whole building will explode like a bomb. You're insane. There are innocent people. There are no innocent people, and there are no happy endings. He checked the ropes, then slowly ran his hands across Catherine's naked breasts, caressing them, and then he leaned down and kissed them. It's too bad we don't have more time. You'll never know what you missed. He grabbed her by the hair and kissed her on the lips. His breath reeked of whiskey. Goodbye, Catherine. Don't leave me, she pleaded. Let's talk. I have a plane to catch. I'm going back to Athens. A moment later the door closed and the bolt snapped shut, then silence. She was alone. She looked at the dial on the boiler. It was rapidly moving from 160 degrees to 170. She fought desperately, but her bonds only grew tighter. The dial had reached 180 and was climbing. There was no way out. None. Alan Hamilton drove like a madman. He turned a corner and hit heavy traffic, slowing him down. In the basement, the boiler had climbed to 200 degrees. The room was growing warm. Traffic was at a standstill. Hamilton, frustrated, thought, should I have called the police? No, they wouldn't have believed me. I have to get to her. Traffic began to move again. The needle climbed to 300. The room was becoming unbearably hot. She tried to free her hands, but the rope stayed tight, cutting into her flesh. He turned onto a side street, cutting off pedestrians. He heard a police whistle, but did not stop. Then a truck pulled out and cut him off. He screamed at the driver, and finally it lumbered away. He raced onward. A trip that should have taken 10 minutes had taken him almost half an hour. In the basement, the needle climbed to 400 degrees. Finally, blessedly, the building was in sight. Hamilton pulled over, hurried out of his car, and started toward the building. He stopped in horror. The ground shook as the entire building exploded like a giant bomb, filling the air with flame and debris and death. Atanas Stavich was feeling terribly aroused. Taking care of a contract always did that to him. He made it a rule to have sex with his victims, male or female, before he killed them, and he always found it exciting. Now he was frustrated because there had been no time to torture Catherine or to make love to her. Atanas looked at his watch. It was still early. His plane didn't leave until 11 o'clock that evening. He took a taxi to Shepherd's Market and wandered the streets, gazing at the prostitutes. He walked up to a tall blonde wearing a brief leather skirt and stiletto-heeled shoes. "Good evening," he said politely. She looked down at him, amused. "Hello, little boy. Does your mother know you're out?" Atanas smiled shyly. "Yes, ma'am. I thought if you weren't busy." The prostitute laughed. "Did you now? Have you ever made love to a girl before?" "Once," Atanas said softly. "I liked it." "You're the size of a minnow," the girl laughed. "I usually throw the little ones back. But it's a slow night. You got 10 bob?" "Yes, ma'am." "All right, love, let's go upstairs." She led Atanas up 2 flights of stairs to her small one-room apartment. Atanas handed her the money. "Well, let's see if you know what to do with it, love." She disrobed and watched Atanas undress. She looked at him in astonishment. "My God, you're enormous." "Am I?" She got into bed and said, "Be careful, don't hurt me." Atanas moved toward the bed. Ordinarily, he enjoyed beating up whores. It increased his sexual satisfaction. But he knew that this was no time to leave a trail that the police might want to follow. So Atanas smiled and said, "This is your lucky night." "What?" "Nothing." He climbed on top of her, closed his eyes and plunged into her, hurting her. And it was Catherine screaming for mercy, begging him to stop. He pounded her savagely, harder and harder, her screams exciting him until finally everything exploded and he sank back, satisfied. "My God," the woman said, "you're unbelievable." Atanas opened his eyes, and he wasn't with Catherine. He was with some ugly whore in a dreary room. He got dressed and returned to his hotel room, where he packed and checked out. When he headed for the airport, it was 9:30. Plenty of time to catch his plane. There was a small line at Olympic Airways. Finally, he reached the clerk, who looked at his ticket. "Atanas Stavich." He looked up, then nodded at a man standing nearby. The man walked over. "May I see your ticket?" Atanas handed him the ticket. "Is anything wrong?" he asked. "I'm afraid we've overbooked this flight. Please come to my office and we'll straighten everything out." "All right." Atanas was jubilant. Demiris was probably out of jail by now. Atanas was looking forward to spending his $50,000, maybe a trip to Rio. He liked the male prostitutes in Rio. Atanas walked into the office and stopped, staring. "You're dead! I killed you!" It was a scream. Atanas was still screaming when they led him out and into a police van. Alan Hamilton turned to Catherine. "It's over now, darling. It's finally over." In the basement, hours earlier, Catherine struggled against the ropes, watching the needle climb past 250 degrees. She glanced at the whiskey bottle that Atanas had left. There was a chance. She slumped down and stretched her feet toward the bottle. It was out of reach. She pressed harder, ropes biting into her bleeding flesh. It was an inch away. One more try, she thought. Her back was raked with splinters, and she pushed again with all her strength. One foot touched the bottle. Slowly, she pulled it toward her. She looked at the dial. 280 degrees. Fighting panic, she gripped the bottle with her numbed hands. Hands slippery with blood, she almost dropped it, but held it tightly and hit it against the concrete. Nothing. The dial climbed 300 degrees, 320 degrees. Steam was pouring out of the boiler. Catherine took a deep breath and slammed the bottle down with all her strength. It shattered, thank God. She gripped the bottleneck and began sawing at the ropes. The glass bit into her wrist, but she ignored the pain. She felt one strand snap, then another, and suddenly her hand was free. She loosened the rope and untied it. Then the cords binding her feet. The dial had reached 380. Jets of steam poured from the furnace. The door was bolted. Catherine had no time to escape from the building before the explosion. She raced to the furnace, but the safety valve was jammed tightly. 400 degrees. She had only a moment. She ran to the far door that led to the bomb shelter, slipped inside, and slammed the door behind her. She lay down, breathing hard, and 5 seconds later there was a tremendous explosion and the room rocked violently. She lay in the dark, fighting for breath. She was safe. It was over. No, not yet, Catherine thought. There's still something I have to do. When the fireman escorted her out an hour later, Alan Hamilton was there. Catherine ran to him and he held her close. "Darling, how did you—" "Later," she said. "We've got to stop at Hannah's Stavich." They were married at Alan's sister's farm in Sussex, and Catherine and Alan spent a quiet weekend at the farm, then flew to Venice on their honeymoon. Alan and Catherine Hamilton checked into their hotel next to the Doge's palace. Their suite was exquisite and overlooked the Grand Canal. "What would you like to do first?" Alan asked. Catherine put her arms around him. "Guess." They unpacked later. Catherine and Alan floated through Venice, relishing the sights, the history, and the tastes. Catherine was in heaven, healed in body and soul, and when she looked at her husband, she thought, "Thank you, God." The only item from the outside world that intruded was the trial of Constantin Demiris. She turned on the radio one stormy afternoon to hear the verdict. The jury reached a decision a few moments ago. To everyone's surprise, the verdict... The radio went dead. Catherine turned to Alan. "What do you think the verdict was?" He took her in his arms and said, "It depends on whether you believe in happy endings." 5 days before Demiris' trial was to begin, he had an unexpected visitor. A crippled old man, hunched in a wheelchair, waited for him. His face was a ghastly patchwork of red and white burn tissue. It took a moment to realize who the visitor was. "My God." "I'm not a ghost," Napoleon Chotas said. "Come in, Costa." Demiris whispered, "The fire." "I jumped out a window and broke my back. I didn't want you to know I was still alive. I was too tired to fight any longer." "I'm glad you're alive." "You should be. I'm going to save your life." "Really, Leon? Why would I put my life in your hands?" "Because I'm the only one who can save you, Costa." Demiris rose. "No thanks. I've persuaded Spyros Lambrou to testify that he was with you when Melina was murdered." "Why would he do that?" "Because taking your fortune would be sweeter than taking your life." "I don't understand." "If Lambrou testifies for you, you'll turn over your entire fortune to him. Your ships, your companies, everything you possess." "You're crazy." "Am I? Think about it, Costa. Is your fortune worth more to you than your life?" There was a long silence. "He would do this?" "That's right." "I would have to keep my everything. He wants to strip you completely. That's his revenge." "But what do you get out of this, Leon?" Chotas smiled. "I get it all." "I don't understand." "Before you turn everything over to Lambrou, you're going to transfer all your assets to a new company. A company that belongs to me." Demiris stared. "So Lambrou gets nothing?" "There are winners and there are losers." "How do I know you won't double-cross me?" "The company will belong to me only on condition that you are acquitted. If you are found guilty, I get nothing." Demiris was becoming interested. Would he throw the trial and lose hundreds of millions of dollars just to get even with me? No, he's not that big a fool. "All right," Demiris said slowly. "We have a deal." "Good, you just saved your life, Costa." "I've saved more than that," Demiris thought. "I have $100 million hidden away where no one will ever find it." It had been hard for Chotas to get Spyros Lambrou to accept his idea, but finally the temptation to ruin Constantin Demiris proved too much. Lambrou watched the crippled lawyer wheel himself out of his office. Poor bastard, he thought. What has he got to live for? The trial was held in the same courtroom where Noel Page and Larry Douglas had been tried. Delmo, the state prosecutor, addressed the jury, laying out the facts of the case. Then, Napoleon Chotas wheeled himself in front of the jury and began his eloquent defense. The trial had begun. The pieces of evidence were introduced, examined minutely, and testimony was taken from each of the investigating detectives. Then it was Chotas' turn. Addressing the chief detective, Chotas acknowledged that Constantin Demiris was an intelligent man. Why, then, he asked, would he leave the knife behind with his fingerprints on it? Well, in the heat of passion, people do strange things. And the button torn from the jacket? Dapper Constantin Demiris would not have noticed it, and hung the jacket back up? The detective shrugged. Mr. Catalanus was on the stand. He was describing his interview with Melina, who wished to hire him for protection. Chotas zeroed in on one point. If Melina was so frightened of Demiris, why had she not hired someone immediately, instead of waiting until the next Monday? It makes one wonder how frightened Mrs. Demiris really was, doesn't it? The Demiris maid was called to testify. She described the conversation she overheard between Molina and Demiris. Had she actually heard Mr. Demiris' voice over the phone? Well, no. You imagined you heard him say those things because of what Mrs. Demiris was saying. I suppose you could put it that way. He turned on her. Mrs. Demiris had intended the maid to overhear the damning conversation in order for this very testimony to be heard after her death. The jury murmured. For 10 days the trial continued, with conflicting opinions and testimony. The consensus was that Constantin Demiris was probably guilty. Napoleon Chotas saved his bombshell until the end. He put Spyros Lambrou on the witness stand. Before the trial, the contracts had been drawn. The Hellenic Trade Corporation now belonged to Spyros Lambrou. A day earlier, those assets had been transferred to Napoleon Chotas. Spiros gave his statement. He had lied to the police earlier because he detested Constantin Demiris, but he could no longer live with a lie. Demiris had been with him at the time of Melina's death, far away from the scene of the crime. There was an uproar in the courtroom. Chotas continued, "And was it not Melina who had set up the meeting?" "Yes," Spiros said. "Is this the truth, Mr. Lambrou?" "Yes, so help me God." The jury was out for 4 hours. Constantin Demiris watched as they filed back into the courtroom. He was pale and anxious. Chotas watched him carefully. All arrogance was gone. This was a man facing death. The verdict was read. The jury finds the defendant not guilty. There was pandemonium, a tide of both applause and hissing from the spectators. Demiris was ecstatic. "You did it," he said to Chotas. "I owe you a lot." Chotas turned to him. "Not any more. I'm very rich and you're very poor. Come on, we're going to celebrate." Demiris pushed Chotas' chair through the crowd, past the reporters to the parking lot. They reached Chotas' car, specially equipped so that he could drive it effortlessly. Demiris helped him in, then got in beside him. "You're still the greatest lawyer in the world," Demiris said. "Yes. What are you going to do now, Costa?" Demiris said carefully, "Oh, I'll get by somehow." "With $100 million, I can build up my empire again," Demiris chuckled. They drove toward the mountains, Demiris watching with admiration as Chotas handled the car easily. "Where are we going?" "I have a little house up here. We'll stop for champagne, then go out to dinner. You know, Costa," he said as he wound up the narrow road, "I've been thinking. Everything that's happened, Noelle's death, and Larry Douglas's death, and poor Stavros, none of it was about money, was it? It was about hate. Hate and love. You loved Noelle." "Yes," Demiris said, "I loved her." "I loved her too," Chotas said. "You didn't know that, did you?" Demiris looked at him in surprise. "No. And yet I helped you murder her. I've never forgiven myself for that. Have you forgiven yourself, Costa? She deserved what she got. I think we all do. There's something I didn't tell you. Ever since the fire, I've been in excruciating pain. The doctors tried to put me back together, but it didn't really work. I'm too badly crippled. He pushed the accelerator lever. They were starting to move fast along the hairpin curves, higher and higher. The Aegean Sea appeared far below them. As a matter of fact, Chotas said, I'm in so much pain that I decided my life really isn't worth living anymore. Slow down, Demiris said. You're going to... So I decided that you and I are going to end it together. Demiris turned to him, horrified. What are you talking about? Slow down, man. You'll kill us both. That's right, Chotas said, pressing the lever again. The car leaped forward. You're crazy. You're rich. You don't want to die. Chotas smiled, a twisted smile. No, I'm not rich. You know who's rich? Your friend, Sister Teresa. I've given all your money to the convent at Ioannina. They were racing toward a blind curve on the steep mountain road. Stop the car, Demiris screamed. He tried to wrest the wheel from Chotas, but it was impossible. I'll give you anything you want, Demiris yelled. Stop! Chotas said, I have everything I want. The next moment they were flying over the cliff, down the steep mountainside, the car tumbling end over end until finally at the bottom it crashed into the sea. There was a tremendous explosion, and then a deep silence. It was over.
Copyright 1990, Dove Books on Tape Incorporated. For a free Dove Books on Tape catalogue, call 1-800-345-9945.